Grim Reaper Paradox. Imagine you're lying in bed, eyes closed, heart steady. You don't know it yet, but you've been selected for a visit from a Grim Reaper. Not the one we often see in folklore with a scythe and a dark hood, but something much stranger. In this paradox, there are infinitely many Grim Reapers. Each one is assigned a specific moment in time. One is scheduled to arrive at exactly 12:00 p.m., another at 11:59 and 59 seconds, another at 11:59 and 59.999 seconds, and so on, each one coming an instant before the last. No matter how small the time increment, there's a Grim Reaper ready to act. Every single Reaper is given a single task. If the person is still alive at their designated moment, they must kill them. If the person is already dead, they do nothing. Now, here's where it gets eerie. Suppose that no Reaper arrives first, because for any Reaper you choose, there's always another who arrives just before them. This leads to a paradoxical situation, because if the person dies, one of the Reapers must have done it. But which one? There's no earliest Reaper to take that fatal action, and yet somehow someone still dies. Death occurs despite the impossibility of identifying the agent responsible. You've been killed by an infinite regress, a sequence with no beginning. This is the heart of the Grim Reaper paradox. It isn't merely about death. It's a philosophical and metaphysical puzzle that calls into question our understanding of causality, time, and the nature of infinity. It paints a surreal picture, an endless chain of causes that leads to an effect without any first cause, a death with no murderer, a termination with no trigger. It's not just confusing, it's hauntingly illogical. The paradox begins with a seemingly simple setup: an infinite number of agents, each assigned a decreasing sequence of times approaching noon. It appears straightforward, like a mathematical game, but once you look closer, everything begins to fall apart. Because there's no first Reaper, and yet death still arrives, we are forced to confront the idea of causation in a world where sequences have no beginning. In our everyday world, causes precede effects. A match strikes before a fire burns, a switch flips before a light turns on. But here, the logic collapses. This infinite regression has a peculiar twist. It's structured with absolute precision. Each Reaper acts only if the person is alive at their assigned time. But that setup, paradoxically, means no Reaper actually gets the chance to act first. Since there is no earliest moment, no Reaper ever steps forward to carry out the act of killing. Yet we are told the person does die. Before 12:00, the sequence ensures death but offers no agent responsible. How can someone be killed if there's no killer? What this paradox reveals is the fragility of logic when faced with the infinite. We often use infinity in math and physics, confident in its abstraction. But when you take that concept and press it against reality, when you turn it into a sequence of events, of agents, of responsibilities, something unsettling happens. Infinity, when treated as something real, creates situations that defy our intuitions, and in the case of the Grim Reaper, it births a world where effects exist without causes. Now let's step back for a moment. What does this mean for the world we live in? Some philosophers use the Grim Reaper paradox to argue against the possibility of infinite sequences of causal events. If such a setup leads to contradiction, if it allows for a death with no first cause, then maybe, they argue, such infinite causal chains can't exist in reality. Maybe time itself must have a beginning. Maybe causal sequences must always be finite. Maybe infinity, though useful, is a conceptual illusion, something that breaks down when stretched too far into the fabric of reality. There's another way to look at it. Suppose we accept the idea of uncaused death in this paradoxical setup. That would mean effects can occur without any specific cause, just the structure of the system is enough to guarantee the outcome. If that's true, then perhaps causality isn't as fundamental to reality as we think. Maybe in some strange corners of the universe, events don't need causes. They just unfold as a result of logical frameworks too large for our intuition to grasp. The Grim Reaper paradox is also deeply unsettling because of its implications for determinism. If every Reaper is bound by deterministic rules, if they must act when their condition is met, then how can the person's death be untraceable? It shows that even in a fully determined system, mystery can arise. Even when every agent behaves predictably, the sum total of their behavior leads to something inexplicable. It's as though determinism folds in on itself, hiding its own outcome behind the veil of infinity. This paradox has also stirred debates in the philosophy of time. Can time be composed of infinitely divisible moments? Can we pack an infinite number of events into a finite duration? The Grim Reaper scenario assumes time is continuous, that between any 2 points in time there is always another. But if this leads to logical absurdities, perhaps time must be discrete, made of indivisible moments, like the pixels of reality. The Grim Reaper paradox becomes a lens through which we view the atomic structure of time itself. And there's something poetic, almost mythic, in the idea of being killed by an infinite horde. No scythe ever swings, no hand ever moves, but death still happens, like a ghost whispering through layers of causality that never quite touch you. It's death by abstraction, death by logic. And perhaps the most chilling aspect of all is that you never saw it coming, because no one ever had to act. You were simply undone by the shape of possibility itself. So what do we do with this paradox? Like many others, Zeno's, Russell's, or The Liar, it doesn't offer easy answers. It isn't a puzzle to be solved so much as a mirror held up to our assumptions. It asks us to consider whether time and causality behave the way we think they do. It dares us to imagine that under the surface of reality lies a scaffolding not of certainty, but of contradiction. And maybe that's the point. The Grim Reaper paradox isn't about death. It's about the limits of understanding. It's about the danger of believing we can map out every step, every cause, every moment. It shows us that even in a world of perfect rules and infinite precision, something can slip through the cracks, something impossible, inevitable, and untraceable. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting truth of all. Knower-God paradox. There exists a paradox so subtle and so striking that it shakes the very concept of omniscience. It asks a question not just about knowledge, but about the very limits of what can be known, even by a god. It's called the Knower-God paradox. It begins with a simple, unsettling question. Can an all-knowing being know that this specific paradox is unknowable? But if it cannot, then it isn't truly all-knowing. In either case, we're left with a contradiction, and as with all great paradoxes, the contradiction isn't just linguistic. It points at the fragile edges of understanding, reality, and the divine. To understand why this question is so profound, we must first explore the idea of omniscience itself. The traditional view of an omniscient God is of a being that knows all truths past, present, and future, actual and possible, logical and experiential. Nothing is hidden, no fact is missed, no event escapes the divine mind. But what if the very concept of all truths includes things that are, by their nature, unknowable? What if there are truths that cannot be known, not by accident, but by design? Not hidden behind curtains, but sealed away by the fabric of logic itself? This is where the Knower-God paradox opens its jaws. It proposes a self-referential idea, the existence of a truth that declares itself unknowable. Think of it like a sentence that says, "This statement cannot be known. If the statement is true, then it cannot be known. But if it cannot be known, how can its truth be known by an omniscient being? If God knows the statement is true, then God knows something that, by definition, cannot be known. But if God does not know it, then we've discovered a limit to divine knowledge." In both cases, omniscience falters, either by collapsing into contradiction or by admitting incompleteness. This paradox is reminiscent of other self-referential traps, such as the liar paradox. This statement is false. If it's true, then it's false. If it's false, then it's true. But while the liar paradox plays with truth, The knower-God paradox plays with epistemology, the nature and boundaries of knowledge. And because omniscience is one of the defining attributes of a perfect God in classical theology, the stakes are higher. We're not just questioning a statement, we're questioning the possibility of total understanding. One might try to escape the paradox by suggesting that there are no unknowable truths, that omniscience simply encompasses everything that exists, including the resolution of this very paradox. But here lies the trap. The paradox defines a specific category of knowledge that, if it exists, must remain beyond grasp. It's not about whether something is unknown in practice. It's about whether something can be known in principle. If a truth is unknowable even in principle, then omniscience cannot contain it. But if omniscience does contain it, then it is no longer unknowable. The paradox consumes itself. Some philosophers have tried to resolve this by redefining omniscience. Perhaps, they argue, omniscience should be limited to all knowable truths. God knows everything that can be known, but not what is logically or metaphysically impossible to know. This is a tempting solution, but it shifts the definition. It replaces a boundless knowing with a conditional one. God becomes the knower of all knowable things. But that raises a deeper problem. Who decides what's knowable? If a paradox declares itself unknowable, and God affirms that unknowability, then does God not validate the paradox's limit? And if God invalidates the paradox, knows it anyway, then the paradox becomes false. But if it becomes false, it cannot prove its own unknowability. So, once again, we fall into circular reasoning. Another angle of escape is to say that the paradox is meaningless, just a word trick, a linguistic illusion. After all, many paradoxes rely on twisting language beyond its natural capacity. But this one is different. It's not merely a statement about words, it's a question about the boundaries of knowledge, and it targets the heart of divine cognition. To dismiss it as meaningless is to ignore its unsettling symmetry, the way it turns the concept of omniscience against itself. There is also a theological response, that God, being beyond time, logic, and human comprehension, is not bound by our paradoxes, that omniscience is not reducible to human categories of knowing. In this view, God does not merely know truths as we do. God is the source and ground of truth itself. The paradox cannot apply because the terms it uses, knowing, unknowable, are pale shadows of a divine reality beyond our grasp. But while this answer protects God's mystery, it also places omniscience beyond investigation. It makes the concept so transcendent that no meaningful discussion remains. And perhaps that's a kind of surrender, not a resolution, but an evasion. So where does that leave us? With a paradox that refuses to die. One that loops in on itself, refusing to reveal a clear resolution. And in that loop, it teaches us something more profound than an answer. It teaches us about the limits of logic, about the boundaries of language, and about the mystery that even the highest ideas must face. The knower-God paradox is not just about God, it's about us, about our yearning for total understanding and our fear that some things may always remain beyond reach. It also suggests a chilling possibility, that knowledge itself may be incomplete, that there may be truths too deep for minds to touch, whether human or divine, and that omniscience, rather than being an all-seeing eye, may be a horizon we approach endlessly but never cross. In that view, God is not the being who knows everything, but the being who contains all mystery. And maybe that's more powerful. Maybe knowing everything isn't about solving every puzzle, but about holding the paradoxes that define existence without needing to destroy them. The knower-God paradox doesn't break omniscience, it reframes it. It shows us that the concept of knowing everything might not be as clean or absolute as we once thought. It reminds us that the divine is not just infinite in scope, but in complexity, and that perhaps, somewhere at the edge of even God's awareness, there lies a question that answers itself with silence. Drinker paradox. Picture a busy bar on a Friday night. The music hums low under the chatter of voices and clinking glasses. Some patrons sip slowly on their drinks, others haven't touched theirs. A few have already left their glasses empty. You scan the crowd and someone leans in and says, "There exists a person in this bar such that if that person is drinking, then everyone is drinking." You laugh it off. That can't be right, can it? But as odd as it sounds, this statement is logically true. Known as the drinker paradox, or more formally, the drinker's principle, it's a tautology, a statement that is always true, regardless of the situation, and yet it feels completely wrong. This paradox begins not with a contradiction, but with a truth, and that's what makes it so disturbing. It asserts that no matter how many people are in the bar or who is drinking or not drinking, there is always at least one person for whom the following holds. If they are drinking, then everyone is drinking. The confusion arises because our minds jump to causal or social reasoning. We assume that one person's drinking implies influence over the group, like a leader setting the tone. But the paradox doesn't work that way. It isn't about cause and effect. It's about the formal structure of logic. And in logic, implication behaves differently than in everyday language. Let's try to unpack it slowly. In formal logic, an implication, if A then B, is considered true in every case except when A is true and B is false. So, if it's raining, then I'll bring an umbrella is logically true when it rains, and I do bring an umbrella, but it's also considered true if it doesn't rain, regardless of whether I bring an umbrella or not. This seems odd at first, but it's the rule of implication. An implication can be true even if the premise never occurred. This is the slippery surface upon which the drinker paradox dances. Now return to the bar. Suppose no one is drinking. Then you can choose any person, say Alice. The statement, "If Alice is drinking, then everyone is drinking," is automatically true because the premise is false. Alice is not drinking. In formal logic, a false premise makes the implication true by default. So the paradox holds. Now, imagine only one person is drinking, Bob. Choose Bob as the person in question. The premise is true. Bob is drinking. But so is everyone else. Just Bob. In this context, everyone is just Bob, and the statement again holds. Now scale it up. Imagine some are drinking and others aren't. Choose someone who isn't drinking, say Carol. Then the implication, if Carol is drinking, then everyone is drinking, is again true. Because she's not drinking, the premise is false. Again, the statement stands. No matter what scenario you paint, the logical structure forces the truth of the paradox. And yet, despite this formal truth, your intuition screams otherwise. There's a psychological dissonance here, an emotional protest. How can something that seems so ridiculous be unshakably true? The answer lies in the difference between how we interpret statements in logic versus in life. In real conversations, we expect implications to suggest causality or relevance. If someone says, "If the boss is late, then everyone will be late," we interpret it as a suggestion of influence, not a cold truth of structure. The drinker paradox feels false not because it is false, but because it mimics a sentence that would imply something socially or causally absurd, and yet it sneaks in through the back door of logic, perfectly valid. This paradox is a special case of a more general principle in predicate logic. From the structure of universal and existential quantifiers, tautologies can arise that defy intuition. The formal statement behind the drinker paradox can be written in logic as x dy dy, meaning there exists an individual x such that if x is drinking, then for every individual y, y is drinking. It merely sets up a conditional that is always fulfilled, either because the person isn't drinking, so the implication is vacuously true, or because, in the rare case where X is drinking, everyone else is too, fulfilling the truth of the implication directly. The drinker paradox opens a door into the way formal logic abstracts from meaning. It treats symbols, variables, and quantifiers without regard for context or connotation. This is both its power and its alienness. In logic, we can prove things that look nonsensical because logic operates outside our emotional and linguistic expectations. It reminds us that truth in logic is not the same as believability in life. That's why this paradox is so effective. It doesn't just test our reasoning, it exploits the gap between mathematical truth and human interpretation. But beyond logic puzzles, the drinker paradox reflects something deeper about the limits of language and the illusions of implication. It shows how easily we conflate syntax with semantics, how quickly we assign meaning where none is needed. It invites us to question the way we frame everyday arguments. When someone says, "If this happens, then everything changes," are they stating a logical truth or an emotional projection? Are our beliefs built on firm deductions, or are they riddled with drinker-like assumptions that feel meaningful but aren't? This paradox is also a gentle warning about the slipperiness of absolutes. The sentence sounds grand: if one is drinking, then all are drinking, as though it carries deep social or philosophical weight. But in truth, it's an empty statement dressed in the robes of profundity. It teaches us that even statements that sound universal and sweeping may rest on nothing but a structural trick, and maybe, just maybe, some of our grandest declarations about society, morality, or reality might carry the same hollowness. So what should we take from the drinker paradox? Perhaps a sense of caution, a respect for the deceptive clarity of logical structures, a reminder that some truths are too cold to feel real, but also an appreciation for how logic, even in its most alien form, can reveal the contours of our thinking. The paradox is a mirror, one that reflects not just formal rules, but our discomfort with them. It is less about drinkers and more about the intoxicating strangeness of truth itself. Banach-Tarski paradox. Imagine holding a solid sphere in your hand, a smooth, perfectly round ball like a toy marble or a globe. Now imagine slicing it into a few pieces, not grinding it into dust, not reshaping it or stretching it, but simply cutting it into a finite number of solid chunks. Then, with a strange and impossible twist, you rearrange those same pieces, without adding anything, without losing a speck of matter, and somehow you end up with not one sphere, but two identical copies of the original ball. Two solid, full-size spheres created from just one. No tricks, no magic, just mathematics. This is the Banach-Tarski paradox, one of the most unsettling results in all of theoretical math, and a paradox that defies our deepest intuitions about volume, matter, and reality. To understand this paradox is to walk a tightrope between abstraction and impossibility. At its heart, the Banach-Tarski paradox is not a magic trick, but a theorem in set theory and geometry. It states that given a solid ball in three-dimensional space, it is mathematically possible to divide it into a finite number of non-overlapping pieces, 5 to be precise, and using only rotations and translations, reassemble them into two solid balls identical to the original. It seems like a violation of physical law. It feels like cheating the universe. But it isn't. It's math at its most abstract, operating in a realm where the rules we live by no longer apply. The key lies in the nature of the pieces. When we say cutting a sphere, we imagine slicing with a knife, clean edges, understandable shapes, but the pieces in the Banach-Tarski paradox are nothing like that. They are deeply non-measurable sets, mathematical objects that are so fragmented, so scattered, that traditional ideas like volume or surface area simply don't apply. These pieces cannot be visualized in any meaningful way. They are not like slices of pizza or wedges of fruit. They are wild, infinitely detailed fractals without structure. And it's precisely this wildness that allows the paradox to unfold. This paradox arises from the strange world of infinite sets, group theory, and the axiom of choice, a controversial and powerful principle in mathematics. The axiom of choice says that for any collection of non-empty sets, it's possible to choose exactly one element from each set, even if the collection is infinite and unstructured. It seems simple enough, but its implications are profound. In the context of the Banach-Tarski paradox, the axiom of choice allows us to construct those bizarre, non-measurable pieces, sets so complex and disconnected that traditional geometry breaks down. With the axiom of choice in hand, mathematicians Banach and Tarski showed that you could partition a sphere into 5 such strange sets and, through nothing more than rotating and moving them around, no stretching, no shrinking, reassemble them into 2 spheres exactly like the first. Each new sphere has the same size, same shape, same everything. It's a duplication of matter out of nowhere, and it's completely legal within the rules of mathematical logic. But before we get swept away in the magic of it, let's make something clear. This paradox does not work in the physical world. It cannot be performed with real balls, or atoms, or even theoretical particles. Our universe runs on the rules of physics, where matter is quantized and indivisible below certain limits. In reality, you cannot slice an object into non-measurable sets, because such sets cannot be constructed in the physical realm. They are artifacts of pure set theory, untethered from spatial or material constraints. Still, the implications of the Banach-Tarski paradox are disturbing. It suggests that our most basic understanding of size and volume can be undone by the mathematics of infinity. It forces us to confront the fact that in the realm of abstract logic, duplicating a ball isn't just possible, it's inevitable. It doesn't violate the conservation of mass because mass doesn't exist in pure mass. It doesn't break the laws of physics because it doesn't apply to the physical world, but it does expose a crack in the foundation of geometry itself. The paradox only works in 3 dimensions or higher. In 2 dimensions, on a flat surface, it's impossible, but the jump to 3 dimensions opens a door to infinite complexity. This dimensional threshold is part of what makes the Banach-Tarski result so strange. It tells us that space itself behaves differently when you look at it through the lens of higher-order abstraction. The familiar world of volume and shape begins to bend under the weight of infinite possibilities. Critics have long wrestled with the implications of this paradox. Some mathematicians have questioned the use of the axiom of choice, pointing out that its ability to construct non-measurable sets can lead to counterintuitive and seemingly absurd conclusions. Others embrace it as a window into a deeper understanding of mathematical structure. After all, paradoxes often serve as signposts, not errors, but clues that we are approaching the boundaries of what our systems can explain. The Banach-Tarski paradox also invites philosophical reflection. If mathematics allows duplication without addition, creation without cost, what does that say about the nature of reality? Is our world built on laws of logic that break down when stretched too far? Or is mathematics merely a toolkit, useful for mapping reality, but not bound by it? This paradox doesn't just challenge our understanding of shapes and volumes, it asks us to question what it means to understand anything at all. It also draws a haunting parallel to the age-old dream of alchemy, transforming matter, creating something from nothing. The Banach-Tarski paradox is the alchemist's dream realized, not in a lab, but on a chalkboard. It conjures a second world from the first, with nothing but the power of logical rearrangement. And while we cannot perform this miracle with our hands, we can carry it in our minds. It is a reminder that the universe of thought has its own strange laws, laws that are no less real for being untouchable. The Banach-Tarski paradox is not a glitch in math, but a feature. It shows us the dazzling, disorienting power of abstraction. It reveals that even the most basic truths, like the idea that cutting something doesn't make more of it, are not sacred in the realm of pure reason. And perhaps that's the paradox's deepest truth, that knowledge, when pushed to its limits, becomes indistinguishable from magic. A ball becomes 2 balls, unity becomes duplication, and the line between logic and illusion disappears, not because we made a mistake, but because the universe of logic is far stranger than we ever imagined. Prisoner's dilemma, infinite iteration. 2 prisoners, 2 choices, 1 classic paradox. You and your partner in crime have been caught and separated. Each of you is offered the same deal. If you betray the other and they stay silent, you walk free while they get the full sentence. If both of you betray each other, you both get a moderate punishment. If both of you stay silent, cooperate, you each get a light sentence. The dilemma is simple. Defect or cooperate. Logic, cold and calculating, tells you to defect. No matter what your partner does, defection offers the best payoff. But trust, loyalty, and something deeper, the whisper of morality, urge you to cooperate. Now imagine the game isn't played just once. Imagine it repeats again and again, forever. Suddenly, everything changes. This is the prisoner's dilemma in its infinite form, where strategy bleeds into ethics and rationality dances uneasily with emotion. In the single-round version of the dilemma, the dominant strategy is to defect. It's the safest move. If your partner cooperates, defecting gets you freedom. If your partner defects, defecting ensures you don't bear the worst of the punishment alone. Cooperation seems naive, a gamble against your own interests. And so, when played once, the logic of self-interest prevails. But in an infinitely repeated version of the game, what's known as the iterated prisoner's dilemma, the simple arithmetic of betrayal, gives way to something more human. The players are no longer bound by a single moment. They now have history, memory, and the power to punish or reward each other across countless rounds. In this landscape, strategy must account not just for immediate gain, but for reputation, retaliation, and the long arc of interaction. Here, the rational choice begins to shift. Defecting in one round might give a short-term benefit, but if it leads to a collapse in trust, it can trigger endless cycles of mutual betrayal. Cooperation, on the other hand, fosters stability. It builds goodwill, encourages reciprocity, and opens the door to a long-term equilibrium where both players benefit more than they ever could through mutual defection. But this equilibrium is fragile. It relies on trust, on memory, and on the belief that the other player values the future enough not to ruin it. The paradox now sits in the open space between logic and belief. If you think your partner will cooperate, it becomes rational to do the same. But if you suspect betrayal, the temptation to strike first becomes overwhelming. Over time, certain strategies emerge. One of the most famous is tit for tat, a simple rule. Start by cooperating, then do whatever your opponent did in the previous round. If they cooperate, you cooperate. If they defect, you retaliate. It's elegant, forgiving, and tough. In simulations, tit for tat has outperformed many more complex algorithms. It thrives because it's predictable, fair, and responsive. It punishes betrayal but never escalates it. It rewards kindness but never allows itself to be exploited endlessly. In an infinite game, tit for tat builds a rhythm of mutual respect. It creates a world where cooperation isn't just possible, but the real world isn't always so tidy. Miscommunication, mistakes, and noise corrupt even the best intentions. A mistaken defection can spark an unintended war of retribution. In such cases, pure tit for tat can spiral into infinite retaliation. So, evolved versions arise: generous tit for tat, win, stay, lose, shift, contrite tit for tat, all trying to balance forgiveness with justice. These strategies represent a deeper realization that rationality in an infinite world must include mercy. It must account for the occasional lapse. In a game without end, the ability to forgive becomes a strength, not a weakness. Yet, even in infinite repetition, the shadow of defection remains. What if your partner plays along for 1,000 rounds, builds your trust, then stabs you in the back for one massive gain? Is it worth the risk? How far into the future must you look to justify continued cooperation? And what if your partner is asking the same question? These layers of speculation create a tension that never fully resolves. Every move becomes a statement, every round a test of character. In this way, the infinite prisoner's dilemma becomes not just a game of strategy, but a reflection of the human condition. We see this dynamic everywhere. In business, where companies must choose between fair competition and sabotage. In politics, where nations face the choice to honor treaties or betray them for advantage. In personal relationships, where loyalty must constantly be weighed against fear and self-interest. Each interaction becomes a small echo of the infinite game. The lessons of the iterated prisoner's dilemma stretch far beyond prison cells and payoff matrices. They speak to the heart of social life, how we build trust, how we manage betrayal, and how we decide what kind of world we want to live in. There's also a haunting twist. While the infinite game encourages cooperation, the promise of endless rounds is, in reality, a fiction. In life, the game might end at any time. An unexpected event, a misunderstanding, or simply the passage of time can bring the interaction to a sudden halt. In game theory, this is called the end game problem. Knowing that the game might end tomorrow, players have an incentive to betray today, and if tomorrow might be the last day, the logic applies to today too, and to the day before. This logic cascades backwards, undermining cooperation even in an ostensibly infinite game. Rationality once again turns against itself. So what's truly rational? Is it smarter to maximize short-term gain or to build long-term alliances? Is faith in others a foolish gamble or a strategic advantage? The infinite prisoner's dilemma doesn't give us easy answers. Instead, it offers a mirror. It shows that rationality is not a rigid path, but a landscape shaped by values, context, and expectations. It teaches us that trust is a kind of wager, and that cooperation, though risky, can yield extraordinary returns when sustained over time. Perhaps the deepest lesson of all is this: in an infinite world, who you are becomes inseparable from how you play. Your choices, repeated endlessly, become your identity. Are you the betrayer, the cooperator, the punisher? Over time, the strategy becomes the self. The dilemma becomes a question not just of logic, but of meaning. How do you want to be remembered? What kind of legacy does your strategy leave behind? The infinite prisoner's dilemma is not a trap, it's an invitation to imagine a future shaped by patience, by resilience, and by the courage to trust, even when betrayal seems safer. It asks us to see beyond the next move to the story we're writing with each decision, and in that story perhaps lies the most rational move of all, not the one that wins the round, but the one that wins the game of life. Zeno's paradox of the arrow. Imagine an arrow in flight. It soars through the air, cutting across the sky with silent grace. To the eye, it's swift, fluid, a blur moving from bow to target. But now, pause the world, freeze time. Focus on one single instant, one frame of that arrow's journey. In that instant, the arrow is not moving. It occupies a fixed position in space, its velocity seemingly absent, its direction meaningless. It is, in every frozen moment, perfectly still. And this leads to a question so ancient and unsettling that it still ripples through philosophy and physics today. If at every instant the arrow is motionless, how can it ever move? This is Zeno's paradox of the arrow, a riddle that fractures our understanding of motion, time, and the very fabric of reality. Zeno of Elea, a Greek philosopher of the 5th century BCE, crafted this paradox as one of several arguments designed to challenge the coherence of motion. In the arrow paradox, Zeno starts with the premise that time is composed of discrete, indivisible instants, like individual snapshots in a film reel. At any given instant, the arrow does not move to another location, it simply exists where it is. And if at every instant it is still, then across all of time, which is made up only of these instants, the arrow never truly moves. Its motion becomes an illusion, a sequence of frozen moments that, somehow, tricks us into believing in continuous change. The unsettling brilliance of this paradox lies in its apparent simplicity. Zeno doesn't argue that motion appears impossible. We obviously observe motion every day. Rather, he challenges the logic behind our observations. If we define motion as change of position over time, but time itself is just a series of instants with no duration, then when does the arrow actually change position? In any one instant, it does not. So if time is nothing but a collection of these instants, the paradox implies that motion is a contradiction, something that cannot logically exist, even though we perceive it constantly. The arrow paradox is closely related to other Zeno paradoxes, like Achilles and the tortoise, or the dichotomy, all of which deal with infinity, division, and the structure of space and time. But the arrow strikes at something even more fundamental: the nature of change itself. It forces us to confront a disturbing possibility that motion, as we conceive it, may not be real, but rather an emergent illusion born from our perception of a continuous flow, stitched together from countless static states. For centuries, this paradox baffled thinkers. Aristotle attempted to resolve it by arguing that time and motion must be continuous, not composed of indivisible moments. But this solution raised its own problems. What does it mean for something to be continuous? Can there be motion that isn't defined by position at a given time? The puzzle persisted into the foundations of calculus, where Newton and Leibniz independently developed the tools of differential mathematics, defining motion not through fixed positions, but through infinitesimal rates of change. Using calculus, one could say that the arrow's velocity is defined as the limit of its change in position over an infinitely small duration. Thus, the arrow can be said to have motion, even if it's frozen in a single frame. But while calculus patched the logical wound, the philosophical scar remained. The paradox wasn't just about math, it was about ontology, about what is real. If the world is made of instants, and at each instant the arrow is still, then calculus might describe motion, but it doesn't explain how stillness becomes movement. It calculates the illusion without resolving the mystery. And this is what gives the arrow paradox its enduring power. It invites not a technical fix, but a deeper inquiry into the metaphysical nature of time. In modern physics, the paradox echoes in surprising ways. Consider quantum mechanics, where particles exist in states of probability until measured, and where the flow of time itself seems less fundamental than we once believed. Or consider the idea of space-time in relativity, where time is not a separate stream flowing onward, but a dimension, like width or height, in which events are fixed. In this view, the arrow's flight is not a journey, but a four-dimensional path, what physicists call a world line, laid out in space-time from beginning to end. The arrow is not moving through time, it simply is, in every location, at every time, already. In this framework, Zeno's arrow finds a strange kind of vindication. There is no now that progresses, no universal clock ticking the arrow forward. The arrow is not crossing space in time, it is a timeless object embedded in the geometry of the universe. Motion then becomes not a change from one state to another, but the way we experience slices of a complete structure we can never see all at once. The paradox in this light wasn't wrong. It was a glimpse through intuition and logic into a reality deeper than perception. And yet, our experience defies this frozen view. We see the arrow fly, we feel ourselves change, we live in a world where time flows and motion matters. If Zeno's logic is sound, but our senses disagree, who is right? Some argue that the paradox reflects the limits of human intuition, our inability to grasp the full nature of time. Others say that motion is a construct, like color or sound, generated by our brains to interpret a reality that may be utterly still at its core. There's also a psychological layer to the paradox. It reminds us how easily our minds can be tricked by framing. If time is treated as a sequence of still moments, then motion disappears. But if we treat time as a continuous process, motion returns. This mental shift mirrors deeper truths about perception and belief. Our view of reality is always shaped by the assumptions we carry, about time, about change, about what it means to exist. Perhaps the arrow paradox doesn't want to be solved. Perhaps its purpose is not to be answered, but to be felt. To remind us that reality is not as stable, nor as obvious as it seems. That under the smooth flow of time lies a riddle, a tension between what is and what appears to be, And in that tension, we find not just confusion, but wonder. Zeno's arrow is not about motion, but about stillness. It asks us to pause in the middle of movement, to look at a single moment and question what it means to move at all. It shows us that between every step, every breath, every heartbeat, there lies an infinite stillness, waiting, unchanging, eternal. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the secret of time begins. Lottery ticket self-reference. Imagine walking into a corner shop and buying a lottery ticket. You don't look at the numbers at first, you're drawn to something else. Printed across the face of the ticket, in bold type, are the words, "This ticket will win if, and only if, it does not win." You pause, puzzled. It reads like a riddle, a joke, or a mistake. But the wording is deliberate. This ticket will win if, and only if, it does not win. Not simply a contradiction, but a perfect mirror, a statement locked in self-reference. And with that single phrase, the ticket drags you into one of the most mind-bending paradoxes of logic and language. A self-referential loop that refuses to resolve, that traps logic in an impossible dance between truth and falsehood. At first glance, it feels like something familiar, like the classic liar paradox, where a person declares, "This statement is false. If the statement is true, then it must be false because it says so. But if it's false, then it must be true because it claims to be false." And so it loops endlessly, each conclusion flipping into its opposite. The lottery ticket is a version of this paradox, dressed up in the language of chance and probability. But it's more than a curiosity. It's a challenge to the very foundation of truth itself. Because in this case, the self-recognition isn't about truth or lies, it's about winning or losing, outcome and non-outcome, success and failure. To say, "This ticket will win if and only if it does not win," is to construct a logical equivalence. The ticket's winning is exactly the same as its not winning. One depends on the other. If it wins, then it must not win, but if it does not win, then it must win. Each possibility undoes itself. No matter what outcome occurs, it contradicts the condition that defines it. If we imagine the lottery being drawn and the ticket declared a winner, that moment proves the ticket did not meet its own condition, because it only wins if it does not win. But if it loses, it then satisfies its condition and must therefore be declared the winner. Reality bends, certainty disappears. What remains is a logical vacuum, a paradoxical statement that cannot be resolved through observation or logic. In a real-world lottery, of course, such a ticket could never exist. The rules of the game, the programming of the draw, the physical act of checking numbers, all of these operate under systems that avoid contradiction. But the paradox is not about the mechanics of lotteries. It's about the architecture of self-reference. It highlights what happens when a system refers to itself in a way that creates a loop, when an outcome defines itself by negating itself. And this is more than a thought experiment. It echoes through the foundations of logic, computation, and even philosophy. In mathematics, such self-referential problems have deep consequences. Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, for instance, are built on the same structure. Gödel showed that in any sufficiently powerful formal system, there are statements that are true but cannot be proven within the system. He constructed these statements using self-referential, with sentences that effectively say, "This statement cannot be proven. If it's provable, then the system is inconsistent. If it's not provable, then the system is incomplete." And so, within the heart of logic itself, Gödel found a riddle, one that mirrors the contradiction of our lottery ticket. The lottery ticket self-reference paradox also resonates in computation, in the field of computer science. Similar loops emerge in the halting problem, which asks whether a program can determine if another program will stop or run forever. Alan Turing proved that no general algorithm can solve this for all possible programs. His proof used a form of self-reference, a program that examines itself and contradicts its own behavior. Just like the ticket that wins only if it doesn't, such programs collapse under their own logic. Even in language, self-representation is treacherous. We are used to sentences referring to things outside themselves, but when a sentence refers to its own truth or outcome or validity, it often creates paradoxes that logic cannot contain. These linguistic loops show the limits of formal systems and of thought itself. We live in a world where reference, meaning, and outcome are tightly woven, but when that fabric folds in on itself, something strange happens. We encounter places where logic no longer guides us, where meaning spirals inward until it disappears. So what does the lottery ticket really reveal? It shows us a universe where rules collapse, where outcomes cancel themselves, and where certainty dissolves. But it also teaches us something about belief, expectation, and the boundaries of knowledge. In ordinary life, we rely on consistency. A ticket either wins or it doesn't. A sentence is either true or false. A light is either on or off. But the ticket's paradox reminds us that some structures defy binary logic. Some ideas refuse to be boxed into win or lose, true or false. They exist only in the tension between opposites, a tension that stretches reason until it snaps. And there's a poetic side to this too. The paradoxical ticket becomes a symbol, a metaphor for the times when we're told, "You'll succeed only if you fail," or "You'll be free only if you give up wanting freedom." These aren't just word games, they're reflections of deeper truths. That desire sometimes defeats itself. That some goals are unattainable precisely because we want them. That belief and doubt, trust and betrayal, love and loss are sometimes entangled in ways that logic cannot sort. In that light, the ticket becomes something more than a contradiction. It becomes a mirror, held up to our desire for certainty, for clarity, for resolution. It shows us the discomfort of the unresolved. It reminds us that not all questions can be answered, not all games can be played cleanly, and not all truths can be neatly divided into black and white. The lottery ticket self-reference paradox cannot be solved. That's its point. It forces us to reckon with the limits of logic, the edges of language, and the strange places where reason stumbles. It invites us not to resolve, but to reflect, not to win or lose, but to understand the shape of the game we're playing. And perhaps in doing so, we come closer not to certainty, but to wisdom, the kind that grows in the spaces between contradiction, in the silences that follow the impossible question. Hangman's knowledge paradox. A prisoner stands before a judge. The room is silent as the verdict is handed down, but it comes with an eerie twist. The judge declares, "You will be hanged next week, but the execution will be a surprise. You will not know the day until the executioner comes for you." A wave of unease settles over the courtroom. The prisoner's fate is sealed, yet his mind begins to race, not with fear, but with logic. How can something be both certain and unpredictable? If he can deduce the day, then it can't be a surprise. But if he can't deduce it, how can the judge guarantee it will happen? Thus begins one of the most perplexing puzzles of rational thought, the hangman's knowledge paradox. The paradox is deceptively simple in form. A hanging will take place next week, on one day between Monday and Friday. The judge's condition is strict. The prisoner must not know the day beforehand. He cannot wake up and say with certainty, "Today is the day." If he does, the condition is violated, and the hanging cannot occur that day. But as the prisoner returns to his cell, he begins to think, and his thoughts spiral into a labyrinth of deduction that seemingly unravels the judge's entire announcement. He starts with Friday. If he hasn't been hanged by Thursday night, then only Friday remains, and if Friday is the only possibility, then he'll know on Thursday night that the hanging must be the next day. But that would violate the condition. It wouldn't be a surprise. So Friday is ruled out. The hanging cannot happen on Friday. With this revelation, the prisoner breathes a little easier at least. That day is safe. But now, he turns to Thursday. If Friday is impossible, then by Wednesday night, if he still lives, Thursday becomes the only remaining possible day. Again, the surprise is lost. He'd know. So Thursday too is eliminated? The logic repeats itself. Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday, one by one, the prisoner crosses out the days. He arrives at a stunning conclusion. The hanging cannot happen at all. The judge's conditions contradict themselves. There is no day left on which the execution could take place without breaking the element of surprise. Feeling victorious in his logic, the prisoner rests easy. Each day passes and he grows more confident in his deduction. Monday arrives, then Tuesday, no knock on the cell door. By Wednesday, he feels smug, but then on Thursday morning, footsteps echo down the hall. The door swings open. The executioner arrives. The prisoner is shocked. The hanging happens just as the judge said it would, and it's a surprise. The paradox has sprung its trap. This is the brilliance of the hangman's knowledge paradox. The prisoner's logical reasoning was flawless at every step. Each conclusion seemed airtight, each step rational, and yet the end result contradicts everything he believed. He thought he had reasoned away the possibility of the event, but the event occurred unexpectedly and in perfect accord with the judge's words. The logic somehow collapsed, but where did it go wrong? The heart of the paradox lies in the concept of knowledge and the limitations of prediction. The prisoner's argument relies on a chain of backward induction. He assumes that knowing the future makes it impossible for that future to occur in the way it was described, as a surprise, but this assumption introduces a recursive trap. His reasoning assumes that his deductions themselves are sufficient to alter the outcome, that the mere act of expecting something nullifies its possibility. But the surprise is not about logical possibility, it's about psychological certainty. The prisoner thought himself too clever to be surprised, and it was precisely that belief that allowed the surprise to occur. Some philosophers have suggested that the paradox exposes a flaw in the way we define knowledge. The prisoner's belief that he can know the unknowable is rooted in a rigid, deductive framework. But knowledge in real life is more fluid, more uncertain. It's shaped by belief, by doubt, by context. When the prisoner ruled out Friday, he assumed that knowing the future would cancel the future. But in reality, his knowledge was based on a fragile chain of reasoning, one that could break at any point if the assumptions shifted. And that's exactly what happened. The hanging occurred on a day he thought was impossible, and so he was surprised. Others see the paradox as a challenge to the predictability of events. We often believe that if we have enough information, we can forecast the future with precision. But the hangman's paradox reminds us that certain kinds of knowledge are self-defeating. To know something with certainty might change the conditions under which it was supposed to happen. The surprise hanging becomes like a quantum measurement. It cannot be observed without being altered. The very act of reasoning about it distorts its nature. This paradox has fascinated logicians, philosophers, and mathematicians alike because it touches so many disciplines. It's been compared to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, where systems collapse under the weight of their own self-representation. It resonates with the ideas of epistemology, the study of knowledge, where what we know and what we think we know are often in tension. And it echoes throughout game theory, where strategies depend not just on actions, but on expectations, and on what players believe about what other players believe. Beyond academia, the hangman's paradox also speaks to something deeply human. It explores the limits of anticipation, the unpredictability of life, the failure of even the best laid plans. We build expectations, develop routines, make predictions. We convince ourselves that the future will unfold according to our logic, but sometimes life walks through the door on a Thursday morning and catches us off guard. It reminds us that not everything can be known in advance. That surprise is not a failure of logic, but a feature of existence. The judge was right. The prisoner was hanged next week, and he did not know the day. The condition was fulfilled. The paradox, for all its complexity, resolved itself in action. And perhaps that's the final twist, that some problems cannot be resolved by thinking alone, that reality has a way of breaking through abstraction, that we can think our way into corners only to find that life does not follow the walls we draw. So the hangman's knowledge paradox endures not because it needs an answer, but because it shows us the boundaries of understanding. It invites us to explore the tension between certainty and surprise, logic and experience. And in that tension we discover not just a puzzle, but a reflection of how we live, how we hope, and how we prepare for the unexpected in a world that often refuses to play by our rules. Stone paradox, infinite regression of explanations. A stone lies motionless on the ground. At first glance, it's nothing unusual, a simple object in a familiar setting. But ask a question, a small question that opens a door into something vast. Why is the stone here? A child might answer, because someone dropped it. A physicist might say, because gravity pulls it toward the Earth. A deeper thinker might say, because mass bends space-time. And with each layer of inquiry, the question does not end, it only deepens. Why does mass bend space-time? Why does mass exist? Why are the laws of physics the way they are? The farther we go, the more we realize something strange. Every answer leads to another question. Every explanation leans on something else, and thus unfolds the stone paradox. An infinite regression of explanations that suggest we may never find a true beginning. The paradox rests not in the stone itself, but in the nature of understanding. Human beings are driven by a deep and instinctive need to explain the world around them. When we see something, we ask why it is so. We peel back the layers, confident that behind each cause is another, more fundamental one. But what happens when that peeling never ends? When every foundation turns out to be resting on another foundation, and there's no bedrock to be found? Let's return to the stone. It's there, on the ground. Why? Gravity. That's the first layer. Gravity pulls it downward. But gravity itself is not a force in the classical sense. According to Einstein's general relativity, gravity is the curvature of space-time caused by mass and energy. So the stone falls because Earth's mass curves the fabric of reality, guiding the stone's path. Why does mass curve space-time? Because that's how the Einstein field equations describe the relationship between mass and geometry. But why those equations? Why not others? Why does the universe obey this particular mathematical structure? This is where the descent begins. Each answer you find is not an ending, it's a step, a signpost pointing to a deeper, darker corridor, and no matter how far you go, another corridor appears. This chain of inquiry isn't just long, it's infinite, and that's where the paradox takes shape. If everything must be explained by something else, then is there ever a final explanation? Can knowledge ever rest? Or are we trapped in a spiral where understanding is always incomplete? The stone paradox is a variant of what philosophers call the problem of infinite regress. In any system of knowledge or explanation, if every claim requires justification by a previous claim, then unless there's a stopping point, an axiom, a brute fact, an uncaused cause, we can never fully explain anything. It's like trying to support a shelf with a bracket and the bracket with another bracket and so on forever, without ever touching the wall. Something must hold everything else up. But what if there's nothing that does? There are a few ways people have tried to escape this paradox. One is to posit a first cause, an ultimate explanation that requires no further justification. In theology, this is often God, a necessary being, uncaused and self-explaining. In philosophy, it might be a metaphysical axiom. In physics, it might be the laws of nature themselves, rules that simply are, without reason or derivation. But this answer, while it halts the regression, leaves a strange discomfort. If we say something just is, aren't we abandoning the very process of inquiry we began with? Why stop here and not one step earlier or later? Isn't saying it just is the same as admitting we've reached the edge of understanding? Another approach is to accept the infinite regress but to reinterpret it. Some argue that not all infinite regresses are vicious. Some may be benign, even illuminating. Perhaps reality itself has no bottom, just layers of complexity. endlessly deep, like a fractal that never settles. Understanding in this view is a process, not a destination. You never arrive, you only descend, learn, descend again. The paradox, then, becomes a mirror of the human condition. We are creatures who strive for completeness in a world that resists closure. Yet for others, this idea is unsettling. If there is no ultimate explanation, then perhaps knowledge is always provisional. Perhaps the stone is here and we can give reasons, but those reasons will always be incomplete. Shadows of deeper truths will never touch. This echoes existentialist thought, that life may offer no final answers, and yet we are compelled to keep asking. The stone paradox, then, is not just about physics or philosophy, it's about meaning itself. Modern science, too, wrestles with this regression. We search for a theory of everything, a single framework that explains all forces, all particles, all phenomena. But even if we find such a theory, will it answer the final why? Or will it simply become the next layer, the next explanation, waiting for its own explanation? Perhaps the dream of finality is itself the illusion. Perhaps the beauty of the universe lies not in being understood completely, but in the fact that it always offers more. And here the stone becomes a symbol, not just of mass and matter, but of mystery. It lies there, mute, dense with unspoken questions. It reminds us that the simplest thing, a stone on the ground, contains within it the entire structure of the cosmos. To ask why it is there is to ask why anything exists at all. And once we begin asking, we find that the questions deepen, multiply, twist in on themselves. There is no end to the inquiry, only deeper wonder. The stone paradox doesn't aim to defeat science or reasoning. It doesn't say we shouldn't ask questions. Instead, it reminds us that every question opens a door, and behind that door are more questions. It humbles us. It cautions against certainty. It invites us to embrace the infinite, not as a problem to be solved, but as a journey to be followed. To see in every explanation not a stopping point, but a starting one. To hold the stone in our hand and feel not just its weight, but the weight of all the invisible forces, principles, and questions that brought it there. The paradox doesn't demand resolution, it demands awareness. It asks us to live with the tension between explanation and mystery, to recognize that even the most solid truths, like a stone, are suspended over depths we may never fully explore. And perhaps that's what makes the search worthwhile. Not because we'll find the final answer, but because we never will. Counterfactual paradox. You stand in your kitchen, holding a delicate glass in your hand. It catches the light in a way that makes it almost shimmer, fragile and irreplaceable. For a moment, your grip weakens. The glass teeters, but you catch it. It never falls. And yet, in your mind, a thought emerges effortlessly. If I had dropped the glass, it would have broken. It's a simple sentence, clear, reasonable, entirely untrue in the literal sense. In total sense of verse, because the glass wasn't dropped, and it didn't break. Nothing happened. And yet you've made a judgment, a statement about a world that never was. This is the counterfactual paradox, a tension between logic and imagination, between what is and what might have been. At first glance, counterfactuals seem ordinary. We use them all the time. If I had studied, I would have passed. If it had rained, we would have canceled the picnic. If I had kissed her, maybe she would have stayed. These statements allow us to think about alternatives, to reflect, to learn. They let us make sense of cause and effect by imagining different choices and outcomes. But from a logical standpoint, they are puzzling, because we are assigning truth values, true or false, to statements about events that never occurred. The glass did not fall. The exam was not failed. The rain never came. So how do we measure the truth of something that didn't happen? This paradox arises because counterfactuals occupy a strange middle ground. They are not simply hypothetical. They are hypothetical with a twist. They make a claim about what would have happened if reality had been different in some specific way. But, in doing so, They seem to imply access to an invisible landscape, a parallel world that never came to be. The paradox asks, how do we know what that world looks like? How can we assert, with confidence, what would have followed from something that never was? Consider the glass again. You say, if I had dropped it, it would have broken. That feels right. Maybe it's a thin glass. Maybe you're standing on tile. You have experience. You've dropped glasses before, they've shattered, so your judgment draws from a pattern. But it's still a judgment, an extrapolation based on a web of assumptions about physics, fragility, and experience. It's not something you can prove. After all, maybe this glass would have landed on a rug. Maybe your cat would have dashed underneath and softened the fall. Maybe it would have bounced unexpectedly and survived. You don't know for sure, and yet you feel confident in the statement. This tension becomes even more pronounced in philosophy and logic. Traditional logic deals with truths, statements that can be shown to be true or false in the world as it exists. But counterfactuals talk about non-existent worlds. This has led to entire branches of thought known as modal logic and possible worlds, semantics. Philosopher David Lewis famously proposed that counterfactuals should be evaluated by comparing our world to the closest possible world in which the counterfactual condition holds true. So in the case of the glass, we imagine a nearly identical version of our world, same kitchen, same moment, except in that world, the glass falls. We then ask, in that world, does the glass break? If it does, then the counterfactual is true. If it doesn't, it's false. But this leads to new questions. What does it mean for one possible world to be closer to ours than another? Is it a matter of physics, probability, emotion? And how do we know what that closest world looks like? We cannot see it. We cannot measure it. It exists only in imagination. And yet, this entire system of reasoning, our ability to make decisions, to reflect, to learn, is built upon these imagined landscapes. The counterfactual paradox also collides with science. In quantum mechanics, outcomes exist in probabilistic superpositions until they are observed. The glass perhaps exists in a haze of possibilities until the moment it is, or isn't, dropped. Does that mean every counterfactual exists somewhere, in some branch of reality? If there are many worlds, perhaps in one of them the glass did fall. But even if that were true, how do we access that knowledge from this world? How do we ground our reasoning in a reality we never touched? Yet paradoxically, counterfactuals are vital. They allow us to simulate outcomes, to plan, to navigate morality and regret. If I hadn't said that, we wouldn't have fought. If she hadn't taken that turn, the accident wouldn't have happened. These thoughts aren't idle musings. They shape our understanding of cause, consequence, and responsibility. We judge actions not just by what they did, but by what else might have happened instead. Justice systems consider what could have occurred. Scientists run control groups to measure what would have happened without intervention. In every corner of life, the unreal holds real power. And this is the paradox's deepest mystery. The unreal shapes the real. Imagined alternatives guide actual decisions. The glass that didn't fall teaches you to hold it tighter. The mistake you didn't make teaches you caution. The opportunity you missed haunts you like a ghost from a life unlived. In some sense, we live surrounded by a shadow realm of possibilities, moments that never occurred but still press their fingerprints into the present. The paradox also humbles us. It reminds us that knowledge is never absolute, that what we think we know about outcomes, about causes, is always framed by assumptions, that our most confident judgments about what would have happened are educated guesses built on patterns, probability, and belief, and that, for all our reasoning, the world remains mysterious. It could always have been otherwise. So the next time you catch a glass before it falls, listen for the whisper. The world you saved it from, the one where it shattered, is not just gone, it never was. And yet it speaks to you. It shapes your thoughts, your care, your choices. The counterfactual paradox is not a failure of logic. It's a window into the way we imagine, anticipate, and respond. It shows us that knowledge is not just about what is, but about what might have been. And in that space between the actual and the possible, we discover who we are, not just as thinkers, but as storytellers, navigating the infinite branches of what could be, with every step we take in the world that is. Paradox of the infinite lottery. Imagine a strange kind of lottery, one that doesn't limit you to picking a number from a set range like 1 to 100 or 1 to a million. Instead, it asks you to pick a number at random from the set of all natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and on forever. There is no upper bound. The set is infinite. The rules are simple. Every natural number is equally eligible, and your choice must be perfectly random. Now comes the question. What is the probability that the number you choose is divisible by 2, by 3, by 10? At first, it feels like we should be able to answer. After all, half of all natural numbers are even, 1/3 are divisible by 3, 1/10 are divisible by 10. But the more you try to pin down the answer, the more it slips through your fingers. Welcome to the paradox of the infinite lottery. In a finite lottery, probability is clean and intuitive. If you have 100 balls in a jar and 50 of them are even numbers, then the probability of drawing an even number is 50 out of 100, or 0.5. If 33 are divisible by 3, the probability is 33%. But in an infinite set, this reasoning collapses. There are infinitely many numbers divisible by 2, but there are also infinitely many numbers that aren't. The same applies for 3, for 5, for any property you care to consider. So what fraction of the infinite set do they truly make up? Can we even talk about fractions of infinity in a meaningful way? One approach to the problem is to use the concept of natural density or asymptotic density. This method looks at the proportion of numbers with a given property in the limit as the numbers get larger and larger. For instance, if we consider the numbers from 1 to n and then let n grow without bound, we can ask, what fraction of that range is divisible by 2? The answer converges to 1/2. Similarly, the fraction divisible by 3 converges to 1/3. So, under this definition, it seems reasonable to say the probability of drawing a number divisible by 2 in an infinite lottery is 0.5. But here's the catch. This approach works only if we assume that our random number is equally likely to be in any position in the list of natural numbers. And that assumption breaks down in the context of actual infinite sets. To say that we can pick a number uniformly at random from an infinite set is, in a very real sense, mathematically impossible. There's no way to assign equal, non-zero probabilities to each natural number in a countably infinite set that will sum to 1. If you try, you quickly run into contradictions. Give each number a non-zero chance of being selected, and the total probability becomes infinite, violating the rules of probability. Give each number a probability of 0, and the total is still 0, meaning no number will ever be picked. So the notion of uniform randomness over the natural numbers is undefined. And this is where the paradox deepens. We're asked to participate in a lottery where the rules sound simple: pick a natural number at random, but the very act of choosing cannot be performed fairly. The selection mechanism cannot exist in any conventional mathematical sense, and yet we're still asked to reason about the outcome. This creates a cognitive dissonance. We try to apply finite intuition to an infinite domain, and the tools break. Now consider how the paradox evolves if we move beyond countably infinite sets. The natural numbers are countably infinite. They can be listed one after the other. But what happens if the lottery involves real numbers between 0 and 1? This is an uncountably infinite set, much larger than the set of natural numbers. In this case, uniform selection is possible. We can define a uniform probability distribution over the interval 1, 0, 1, and it works beautifully. Each subset of that interval has a well-defined measure. We can say precisely the probability of picking a number between 0.3 and 0.7 is 0.4. So here we reach a strange boundary. In uncountably infinite sets, uniform randomness is coherent and useful. In countably infinite sets, it becomes paradoxical. This reveals a peculiar reversal of expectation. You'd think the larger, more complex infinities would be more unruly, but it turns out the opposite is true. The real numbers between 0 and 1 can accommodate randomness in ways the simpler natural numbers cannot. The infinite lottery over real numbers behaves as you'd expect, but the lottery over natural numbers becomes a puzzle, a trick question dressed as a game. One way to make sense of this paradox is to abandon the idea of uniformity altogether. Instead, we can define custom probability distributions over the natural numbers, say a geometric distribution, where each successive number has half the chance of the one before it. This makes the probabilities converge to 1 and allows us to perform meaningful analysis. But then, we are no longer picking uniformly at random. We've changed the rules to avoid the paradox, not resolve it. The original question remains: what does it mean to pick fairly from an infinite countable set? The paradox of the infinite lottery doesn't just expose the limits of probability, it reveals the tension between intuition and abstraction. It shows that infinity is not a quantity, but a process, a direction, a shape of thought that resists containment. When we say randomly pick a number from an infinite set, we invoke a phantom action, something that cannot be done, but feels like it should. We import logic from the finite world into a place where logic shifts beneath our feet. In practical terms, this paradox reminds us to tread carefully when reasoning about infinite processes. It tells us that not all infinite sets are created equal, that randomness, fairness, and symmetry, concepts we take for granted, are fragile when stretched across infinity. It also hints at deeper philosophical questions. Can all that is conceivable be possible? Can we talk about outcomes in a game that can never be played? The infinite lottery is not a problem to be solved, but a mirror held up to our assumptions. It asks us to reflect on how we reason, how we measure, how we define fairness and choice. It shows that sometimes the simplest questions, like, what's the chance of picking an even number, are the ones that lead us into the deepest mysteries. And perhaps that's the real prize of this impossible lottery, not a winning number, but a glimpse into the beautiful strangeness of infinity. Quine, sentence generator. Consider a sentence that loops in on itself, like a snake devouring its own tail. A statement that refers not to the world, not to an object, but to itself. It doesn't describe the weather, or a fact, or an emotion. It describes its own truth. Now imagine that sentence reads, "This sentence is false if and only if it is not true. It is not nonsense. It is grammatically clear. It appears to follow logic. And yet, as you try to decide whether it is true or false, you find your mind circling endlessly. Every attempt to evaluate it collapses into contradiction. Welcome to the strange looping world of Quine sentences, a realm of linguistic self-references, where truth becomes tangled in its own mirror image." At first glance, this sentence seems like a clever twist on the classic liar paradox. That paradox is simpler. This sentence is false. If the sentence is true, then what it says must be the case, so it must be false. But if it's false, then what it says isn't true, so it must be true, and thus the loop begins. The Quine sentence complicates this by embedding a logical structure within the statement. False if and only if not true. It seems like we've added precision, but that precision only deepens the confusion. The sentence defines its own truth through a contradiction of itself. It becomes a linguistic Mobius strip, twisting, smooth, and endless. To explore the paradox, let's try to analyze it step by step. Suppose for a moment that the sentence is true. Then the statement, "This sentence is false if and only if it is not true," must hold. But if the sentence is true, then the right side of the "if and only if" must also be true, that it is not true. So we've reached a contradiction. The sentence is true, but that truth implies it is not true. That's impossible. Now, suppose the sentence is false. If the sentence is false, then the claim, "This sentence is false if and only if it is not true," does not hold. That would mean either it's false and it is true, or it's not false and it is not true. But no matter how we move the pieces, we return to an impossible space, where a sentence is true if and only if it is not true. It seems as though the sentence is both true and false simultaneously, or perhaps neither. In any traditional system of logic, that simply shouldn't happen. This is the unsettling power of self-referencing. In language, self-referencing is the act of a sentence referring to itself, not indirectly but explicitly. Most language refers outward. We say, "The cat is on the mat," and we look to the mat for confirmation. But Quine sentences, named after the philosopher and logician W.V. Quine, turn language inward. They refer to their own semantic status, and when they do so in particular ways, especially ways involving truth or falsehood, they twist logic into knots that even formal systems can't untangle. In classical logic, every proposition must be either true or false. There is no in-between. This is the law of the excluded middle. But Quine sentences violate this principle by creating a loop that defies classification. They don't just resist evaluation, they make evaluation impossible within the framework they exist in. The sentence collapses the boundary between object and subject, between language and metalanguage, between saying and being said. This leads us to a profound question. Is the problem with the sentence itself, or with the system we're using to understand it? Some logicians argue that such sentences reveal the limits of classical logic, that we need richer, more nuanced systems to handle self-references. Others suggest that the sentence is simply meaningless, that it doesn't truly express a proposition at all. It appears to make a claim, but that claim dissolves when examined. One such system is para-consistent logic, which allows for contradictions without collapsing into total incoherence. In these systems, a statement can be both true and false at the same time, without the system exploding into nonsense. Another is dialetheism, the philosophical position that some contradictions are actually true. Under this view, the Quine sentence isn't a failure of logic. It's an example of how reality itself can be inconsistent at the deepest level. These approaches are controversial because they challenge the foundations of how we think and reason. Most of us are taught that if something is true, then it is not false, and vice versa. But Quine sentences and the paradoxes they embody ask us to reconsider whether truth is as binary and stable as we believe. They suggest that at the very limits of language and thought, the structure we rely on might begin to bend. We can also explore this paradox through the lens of computing and formal systems. In computer science, similar self-referential issues arise in the form of the halting problem, the question of whether a program can determine in all cases whether another program will stop or run forever. Alan Turing showed that no such universal program exists. His proof relies on a kind of self-referential, a program that asks whether it halts when it analyzes itself. It's the same structure as the Quine sentence, embedded in code instead of language. Quine sentences also reflect something deeply psychological. They show how the mind struggles when it tries to model itself. We can observe the world easily, judge it, form beliefs, but when we turn that process inward, when we try to observe the observer, the system destabilizes. Our thoughts loop. Our judgments about our own thoughts become recursive, layered, and paradoxical. These moments aren't just abstract puzzles, they mirror the experience of self-awareness, the difficulty of knowing yourself, predicting your own behavior, resolving your own contradictions. In this way, the Quine sentence becomes more than logic. It becomes a metaphor for consciousness. Ultimately, the sentence, "This sentence is false if and only if it is not true," resists interpretation not because it is flawed, but because it is pure. It reflects the limits of our structures, the edge of the map where reason becomes fog. It isn't meant to be solved, but to be held, gently, like a mirror reflecting back the impossibility of perfect understanding. It reminds us that even in the domain of logic, where rules are precise and certainty seems possible, there are corners where language curls inward and paradox sits waiting. And so, the Quine sentence generator offers more than a puzzle. It offers a revelation that truth is not always clean, that meaning can fold into itself, that logic, for all its clarity, has shadows it cannot banish. In those shadows, paradoxes like this one whisper, not to confuse, but to invite us deeper. To see that the search for understanding doesn't end in answers, but in the questions that refuse to be answered. Paradox of ideal descriptions. Imagine you're handed a map, beautifully drawn, intricately detailed, a masterpiece of cartographic precision. Every street, every shadow, every blade of grass is captured with perfect fidelity. At first, you're amazed. But then you realize something strange. The map is as large as the city itself. You can't fold it, you can't carry it, you can't even use it, because it takes up the same space as the place it's meant to describe. In fact, it's not really a map anymore, it's just another version of the city. This is the heart of the paradox of ideal descriptions. It suggests that to describe a system in perfect detail, your description must match the complexity of the system. But in doing so, it ceases to be a description at all. It becomes a replica, a shadow with the same weight as its source. At first, the idea of a perfect description seems noble, even attainable. Science, after all, is driven by the desire to understand, to take the chaos of nature and explain it through models, formulas, and theories. But this pursuit contains a hidden trap. The more precise a description becomes, the more it must reflect every nuance, every fluctuation, every tiny piece of the system it's trying to explain. And as the description becomes more detailed, it also becomes more complex. Eventually, the line between the system and its model begins to blur. This paradox can be found lurking in many domains. In physics, we use equations to describe the motion of objects. These equations simplify reality, ignore air resistance, assume perfect spheres, constant gravity. But the more we try to account for real-world conditions, the more our equations balloon in complexity. If we attempted to write an equation that accounted for every particle, every force, every possible interaction in the universe, that equation would be indistinguishable from the universe itself. We would no longer have a model, we would have a mirror. In computer science, the problem appears again. Suppose you want to simulate the behavior of a system, a weather pattern, a traffic grid, an ecosystem. You create a model, input the variables, let it run. The simulation approximates reality, but the more variables you add, every gust of wind, every ant on the ground, every driver's impulse, the more the simulation becomes as massive and unwieldy as the system it mimics. The idea of understanding through simplification breaks down. Your model is no longer a guide, it's a rival reality. Even in language, we see this tension. We tell stories to make sense of the world, but no story, no matter how rich, can capture every element of an event. The moment you try to tell everything, the thoughts of everyone present, the sensory data from every angle, the historical context of every detail, you no longer have a story. You have an encyclopedia. And even that might not be enough. Because life, unlike text, is continuous. It flows. It resists summary. The perfect description of an experience would not be a report. It would be the experience itself, relived in full. This leads to a striking realization that the act of describing is inherently reductive. To describe something is to abstract from it, to compress it into something more manageable, more symbolic. A description, by its very nature, must leave things out. It must choose what matters and what doesn't. It must be smaller than the thing it describes, or else it ceases to function as a description. But if every description is incomplete, does that mean complete understanding is impossible? That's one interpretation. The paradox seems to suggest that the price of total fidelity is usefulness. The moment you describe everything, you can no longer act on the information. You're overwhelmed, drowned in detail. So instead, we settle for models that are good enough. We accept maps that distort scale, theories that ignore edge cases, summaries that skip nuance. And we call that understanding, not because it's perfect, but because it's practical. There's something deeply human in this. We are pattern-seeking creatures, not machines. We need frameworks, not full renderings. We can't carry a city-sized map, but we can carry a sketch that gets us where we need to go. And yet, the paradox lingers in the background. It whispers that all knowledge is shadow play, that even our most brilliant theories are just silhouettes cast on the cave wall of truth. In philosophy, this tension is reflected in discussions of representation and reality. Plato imagined a world of perfect forms, ideal versions of everything we see. But perhaps those perfect forms are unreachable not because they are far away, but because they collapse into identity. The perfect description of a chair is not a paragraph or a blueprint, it's the chair itself. Anything else is merely an approximation, and so perfection becomes indistinguishable from redundancy. In mathematics, too, we confront the limits of description. Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed that in any sufficiently complex system, there will be true statements that cannot be proven within the system. This means that no description, no system of rules or symbols can be both complete and consistent. The map will always have blank spots. The description will always have gaps. So what are we left with? A humbling view of knowledge, a recognition that every act of understanding is also an act of exclusion, that to know something fully is to make peace with what we cannot capture, that the map is not the territory and never will be. But this isn't a defeat. It's a quiet liberation. It frees us from the impossible task of total description and invites us to focus instead on what matters most. A good map doesn't need to show every tree, it just needs to show the path. The paradox of ideal descriptions isn't a call to abandon precision. It's a reminder that precision has limits, and that usefulness often lies just before those limits are reached. It encourages us to think not just about what is true, but about what is helpful. To embrace the beauty of models, metaphors, and simplifications, not as lies but as tools, as stepping stones to deeper, if never complete, understanding. The paradox doesn't tell us that descriptions are pointless. It tells us that description is an art, a balancing act between too much and too little, between clarity and complexity, between knowing and knowing enough. And in that space between the system and its reflection, we find meaning, not in the perfect mirror, but in the shapes we choose to draw. Paradox of sufficient reason. Everything happens for a reason. It's a phrase we hear so often that it becomes a kind of soothing chant, a comfort against the chaos of life. Behind that phrase lies a principle, ancient, powerful, and deceptively simple. It's known as the principle of sufficient reason. It states that for everything that exists, there must be an explanation. Nothing occurs without a cause, nothing is real without a reason why. But like many principles that appear obvious, this one hides a paradox. If everything must have a reason, then what about the sum total of everything? What about the entire universe or reality itself? What is the reason for the whole, and can that reason include itself? This is the paradox of sufficient reason, a question that pushes the bounds of logic, metaphysics, and existence itself. The idea has its roots in the work of philosophers like Leibniz, who believe that nothing is without explanation, not even the most basic truths. The universe, he argued, must have a reason for being. It cannot simply be. Its existence must be grounded in something more fundamental, a deeper cause, a necessary being, an ultimate explanation. For Leibniz, this necessary being was God, a self-explaining reality that causes all else. But even as he built his argument, a strange tension formed beneath it. Because if everything needs a reason, and that reason must be external to the thing itself, then what explains the reason? What explains God, or the laws of logic, or the very fabric of reality? Here lies the heart of the paradox. If every truth, every event, every entity must be explained by something else, then we are launched into an infinite regress of reasons. Each explanation requires another, each foundation rests on a deeper layer, and unless something breaks the chain, we can never arrive at a final answer. But if we do break the chain, if we accept some reason as fundamental and self-explaining, then we seem to violate the very principle we began with. We carve out an exception to the rule of reason just to stop the descent. So we face a dilemma. Either the principle of sufficient reason leads us into an infinite regress, or it must stop somewhere and thereby contradict itself. If everything has a reason, then so must that final reason. But if that final reason needs no reason, then not everything has a reason after all. It's a loop without closure, a system that consumes itself in its own demand for explanation. One proposed resolution is to accept that some things are necessary rather than contingent. A contingent thing is one that could have been otherwise, it depends on something else for its existence. But a necessary thing exists by its very nature. It could not be otherwise. Its existence is not explained by something else, but by itself. This is the strategy Leibniz took with God. God, he argued, is a necessary being whose reason for existence lies in his own nature. But this answer feels like a shift in the rules. It doesn't solve the paradox, it sidesteps it. It replaces explanation with assertion. It tells us the chain stops here, but it doesn't explain why it must. Others argue that the paradox reveals a flaw in the principle itself. Maybe not everything needs a reason. Maybe some things just are. The universe, the laws of physics, the initial conditions of time, perhaps these are brute facts, uncaused and unexplained. This view, though pragmatic, feels unsettling. It invites us to accept mystery not as a problem to be solved, but as a permanent feature of reality. It gives up the search for grounding and instead asks us to live with the floating weight of existence. There is also the possibility that the demand for explanation is a human projection. We crave reasons because they make the world seem intelligible, ordered, and secure, but the universe may not be obligated to satisfy that craving. What we call the principle of sufficient reason might reflect the structure of human understanding more than the structure of reality. If so, the paradox doesn't reveal a problem with existence, it reveals a problem with us, with our need for neat chains of cause and effect in a cosmos that may not provide them. And yet, the desire for explanation persists. We want to know why. We want the story of everything, the key that unlocks the totality. We look to cosmology, metaphysics, theology, trying to answer the same question in different languages. Why is there something rather than nothing? What breathes fire into the equations, into the void, into being itself? Some contemporary physicists attempt to approach this question through theories of multiverses or quantum fluctuations. They suggest that the universe may have emerged spontaneously from a quantum vacuum, or that every possible universe exists and we just happen to be in one that supports life. But these models often shift the question rather than answer it. Why this quantum vacuum? Why these laws? Why any structure at all? Even mathematics cannot escape the paradox. The axioms of logic, the laws of identity and non-contradiction, must be accepted to begin reasoning, but they cannot be justified from within the system they support. They are the unprovable foundations of all proof. The sufficient reason for reasoning itself is unreachable from the tools reasoning provides. And so the paradox of sufficient reason remains suspended at the edge of thought. It cannot be resolved, but it cannot be ignored. It reminds us that the most fundamental questions may always hover just beyond our grasp, that perhaps the final reason for all things is not a thing at all, but the shape of questioning itself. That to be conscious is to wonder, and to wonder is to live with mystery. Perhaps the paradox is not a flaw in the structure of reason, but a reflection of something deeper, an acknowledgement that the totality cannot be captured from within. Just as a book cannot describe itself without turning inward, folding into abstraction, Maybe the universe cannot explain itself from inside its own story. Maybe the reason for everything, if it exists, is not something we will find, but something we already are. A momentary aperture in the vastness, glimpsing itself and asking, again and again, why? Measure paradox. Imagine an endless stretch of flat, featureless space. It goes on forever in every direction, no boundaries, no edges, no center. Now picture two identical shapes, perfect copies, indistinguishable in form and size, floating somewhere in that space. You want to pick one at random, no biases, no preferences, just a fair choice. But here comes the problem. If space is infinite and every location is the same as every other, then what does picking randomly even mean? Where do you start? How do you assign equal probability across an unending, undivided expanse? This is the measure paradox, a puzzle born from the intersection of infinity, geometry, and probability. It seems simple. Choose between two equal things in an infinite field. But the more you try, the more you realize that without a way to define where, fairness becomes impossible. The paradox begins with a question of measure. In finite spaces, we know how to assign probabilities. You can flip a coin, 2 outcomes, each with a probability of 1/2, roll a die, 6 sides, each with 1/6, choose a point from a circle. Any arc length can be assigned a proportion based on its angle. But when you move into infinite space, the very idea of proportion becomes unstable. If every location in space is equally likely, and there are infinitely many of them, then the probability of any specific point being chosen is 0. But 0 times infinity is not defined. You've lost your measuring stick. Suppose you try anyway. You define a region, a box perhaps, and say that within that box you'll randomly select a point. Then you ask, what's the chance the point falls closer to shape A or shape B? If the shapes are both inside the box, no problem. You can measure their relative positions and divide space accordingly. But what if one shape is slightly outside the box or far away? In infinite space, any finite box captures a vanishingly small part of the whole. The rest of space stretches beyond it, untouched, unaccounted for. So your probability is biased by where you draw your imaginary boundary. The result changes depending on how you frame the question. This reveals a deeper issue. In infinite space, there is no natural origin, no central point, no favored direction. Every location is just like every other. So any attempt to define randomness must involve choosing a reference point, a place to start measuring from. But that choice is arbitrary. If you shift your starting point, you change your measure. Two observers using different frames might disagree about which shape is more likely to be chosen, even if the shapes are identical, and that breaks the very notion of fair probability. This problem is a special case of a broader issue in mathematics known as the non-existence of a translation invariant probability measure on infinite sets. In simpler terms, it means that you cannot define a uniform probability distribution over an infinite space that treats every point equally and still produces meaningful outcomes. Any attempt to do so leads to contradictions, undefined expressions, or dependence on arbitrary choices. Probability becomes directionless, and with it, fairness dissolves. The measure paradox shows its face in many guises. In cosmology, it appears in the study of the infinite universe. If the cosmos is truly infinite, and every kind of event happens somewhere, then how do we assign likelihoods to what we observe? Are we typical observers or rare ones? If there are infinite copies of Earth, how do we define the probability of being this particular you, living this particular life? Without a way to measure typicality in infinity, predictions become unreliable. Some theorists try to solve this by carving up infinity into finite regions, so-called cutoff measures. But these solutions are deeply sensitive to how the cuts are made. Change the shape or size of the region, and you change the outcome. The paradox also appears in paradoxical games and thought experiments. Imagine a casino with infinitely many tables, each offering a different game. If you select a table at random, what's the probability you land at any given one? You can't assign equal probability across an infinite number of options. Try to, and you'll find that every individual outcome has a probability of 0, and yet the total must be 1. This is more than a mathematical curiosity. It shows the limits of intuition when dealing with the infinite. One famous example is the Banach-Tarski paradox, which states that a solid ball can be split into a finite number of pieces and reassembled into two identical balls. This result depends on the axiom of choice and a measure-free space. It defies our understanding of volume and fairness. The measure paradox is its probabilistic cousin. It shows that without a measure, without a defined way to weigh the infinite, choices cannot be fair, and likelihoods cannot be grounded. In physics, measure problems haunt the interpretation of quantum mechanics in the multiverse. When there are many worlds, each branching from every quantum event, what determines the probability of landing in any given one? If all outcomes happen, why do we experience the ones we do? These questions depend on assigning weights to outcomes, but in an infinite field, the weights blur. The same problem appears in decision theory, where infinite reward structures challenge the coherence of expected value. How do you choose rationally when every option yields an undefined or infinite payoff? So, what's the resolution? One response is to accept that infinity defies uniform probability, that true randomness over infinite sets is illusory, and that all meaningful probabilities must be grounded in finitude. We can only define fairness when we limit the scope, when we set a boundary, however artificial. Another approach is to embrace subjective probabilities, Bayesian reasoning, which shifts the focus from objective randomness to personal belief. But this doesn't eliminate the paradox. It only reframes it. Perhaps the measure paradox is not meant to be solved, but to be respected. It marks the boundary between the conceivable and the definable, between the imaginable and the measurable. It reminds us that even in a world governed by rules, the rules have edges. And beyond those edges lies a kind of structured ambiguity, a space where equality cannot be defined because the very act of definition imposes inequality. The paradox doesn't say that probability is broken. It says that our tools, our intuitive and mathematical frameworks, struggle in the face of the boundless. Infinity is not just large, it is a different kind of thing. And in that vastness, even the simplest acts, a coin flip, a choice between 2 points, become unspeakably complex. The measure paradox invites us to pause before the infinite and accept that sometimes the desire for fairness cannot be fulfilled, not because the universe is unjust, but because, in infinity, fairness itself becomes undefinable. Lost message paradox. Imagine one quiet morning, you find a note slipped under your door. No name, no signature, just a simple message. Do not go to the station at 4 p.m. today. Something terrible will happen. You don't recognize the handwriting, there are no clues as to who sent it, but something about it feels real, urgent, even sincere. Against your usual instincts, you decide to stay home. Hours later, you see breaking news, a train accident at the very station you were warned about, lives lost, chaos, and a chill runs down your spine. Because the message didn't just warn you, it may have saved you. But now, you're left with a question that won't leave you alone. If the message came from the future, and your actions prevented the event it warned about, then why was it sent in the first place? This is the lost message paradox. It isn't just a puzzle about time travel, it's a riddle about causality, logic, and the fragile relationship between cause and effect. At its heart, it reveals something deeply unsettling, that certain types of information, if acted upon, have the power to erase the conditions that made them exist. A message from the future, by changing the past, can eliminate its own reason for being, but if it no longer needs to be sent, how did it arrive in the first place? The paradox unfolds with an eerie elegance. Suppose someone in the future sees a catastrophe unfold, a disaster that costs lives. That person, armed with future knowledge and technology, sends a message back in time to prevent it. The message reaches someone in the past. They read it, believe it, and act. As a result, the disaster is averted. But here's the twist. In this new timeline, the catastrophe never occurs, so the future person who originally sent the message no longer has a reason to send it. And if the message was never sent, then it could not have been received. But if it was never received, then the event was never prevented, which means it does happen, which means the message is sent. The loop closes on itself, logical, perfect, and impossible. This is the core of what physicists and philosophers call a causal loop, or a time loop. A piece of information or an action exists in a closed cycle of causality. It has no true beginning. It exists because it causes itself. But the lost message paradox adds a special twist. It involves negation. The message not only loops, it nullifies its own reason for being. It's not just a closed circuit of cause and effect. It's a contradiction wrapped in intention. In fictional settings, this paradox plays out in stories of time travel warnings, future visions, and prophecy. A scientist sees a city destroyed and sends a signal back to prevent the experiment that caused it. The experiment is stopped. The city remains safe. But then, how was the future scientist ever motivated to send the message? And if they weren't, then the experiment happens, the message is sent again, and so the loop resets endlessly. These stories aren't just dramatic, they mirror real concerns in theoretical physics. Some physicists argue that time travel into the past, if it were possible, would be subject to self-consistency. This principle, proposed by Igor Novikov, suggests that any action taken in the past by a time traveler or by a message must be consistent with the timeline that led to it. In other words, paradoxes like the lost message cannot occur because the universe simply doesn't allow inconsistent loops. If the message is received, then it must play a role in causing the future where it is sent. And if it prevents the event, it must do so in a way that still leads to the message being sent. But this idea, while elegant, feels artificial, like a rule imposed to patch a hole in logic. Others explore multiverse interpretations. In this view, when the message is received and acted upon, it creates a branching timeline, a new world in which the disaster is prevented. The original timeline still exists, and in that world, the message is still sent. But in the new world, the message seems to appear from nowhere because its sender exists in a parallel universe. The paradox is avoided by spreading causality across worlds, but this raises its own questions. Can information travel across timelines? If the original sender no longer shares the same reality as the recipient, are they truly linked? And what does it mean for something as fragile as a message to survive such a crossing? There's also a philosophical angle. The lost message paradox touches on questions of knowledge, intention, and determinism. Can you change the future if your actions are based on knowledge of that future? Or does that very knowledge trap you in a loop where your attempts to escape ensure the outcome? If you read a warning from the future, are you free to act on it? Or are you already part of a chain that must play out exactly as written? The paradox also exposes the fragility of explanation. We depend on the idea that causes precede effects, that the past explains the present, and the present determines the future. But in this paradox, that arrow is reversed. The future reaches back and rewrites the past. The message exists not because something happened, but because something almost happened. The very idea of truth. Is the message true if the event it predicts never occurs? Is it false? Or is it a kind of quantum ghost, real only in the moment it is read, dissolving as the timeline adjusts? The lost message paradox doesn't just stretch logic, it shatters the boundary between action and memory. It asks us to consider whether time is fixed or fluid, whether the future is a place we can visit or a shape we constantly sculpt. It dares us to believe in communication that is unanchored from causality, floating freely between what is and what could be. And in doing so, it shows us just how fragile our sense of reality truly is. Perhaps the paradox is not a flaw but a message in itself, a message about the limits of certainty, about the impossibility of knowing whether a warning is real if it works, about how some truths disappear the moment we believe them, and how sometimes the act of saving the future leaves us with nothing but a mystery. A message with no sender, a warning with no disaster, a story with no beginning. Temporal twin paradox. Picture a moment suspended between science fiction and metaphysics. You step into a time machine, a gleaming device humming softly with the energy of space-time. You dial the coordinates, not to a distant civilization or a prehistoric jungle, but to a moment from your own life, a week ago. You press the button. In an instant you arrive, you step out, and there you are. Not a photograph, not a memory, but your actual, living, breathing self, existing simultaneously in the same space and time. You stare at each other, eyes locked, two versions of one identity, and a single question blooms in your mind with impossible weight. Which one of us is me? This is the temporal twin paradox, a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of identity, time, and personal continuity. If you travel backward through time and meet yourself, who holds the claim to being the real you? Are you the traveler, who remembers the future and carries knowledge of what's to come? Or are you the version still embedded in the past, unaware of what lies ahead, believing yourself to be the only version of you that exists in that moment? It seems like a puzzle about time travel, but at its heart, it's a philosophical labyrinth about what it means to be the self. Let's imagine the meeting in detail. You walk up to your past self. You talk, you laugh, you exchange memories. You both remember everything up until that point, but only you, the traveler, remember what comes next. You feel older, wiser, maybe tired. Your past self feels energetic, confident, unaware of the days ahead. But you both have the same memories up until a moment ago. The same fingerprints, the same blood type, the same habits, the same body, only separated by time. And now, that separation has collapsed. Who then is the original? Is it the one whose timeline is progressing naturally, without interference? Or is it the one who broke the linear flow, jumped the rails of chronology, and inserted themselves into their own history? If you consider the version living in the past to be the original, after all, they're in the place and time they're supposed to be, then what does that make you? A duplicate? A copy? A future echo? But if you, the traveler, are the original because you come from a more advanced point in your personal timeline, then what is your past self? Just a stepping stone? A lesser version? A placeholder? The paradox becomes even more tangled when we ask what happens next. Suppose you decide to stay in the past for a while. You and your twin now share the same world. Do you live in the same house? Share the same friends? Compete for the same decisions? What if your past self starts making different choices, creating a new path that diverges from the one you remember? Do they still become you? Or do you now represent a forked version of the timeline, a timeline that, because of your presence, can never be the same? Philosophers call this a problem of personal identity over time. Normally, we think of ourselves as continuous beings. We age, we grow, we change, but the thread of identity runs unbroken through our memories, our experiences, our sense of self. But time travel fractures that continuity. Suddenly, there are two versions of you, with equal claim to the identity, coexisting and diverging in real time. The simple notion of I becomes slippery. Who gets to carry the title of me when me is no longer a single, linear being? Some might argue that you're both the same person, just at different points in a single timeline. In that view, the traveler and the past self are different temporal stages of one individual, temporarily brought together. It's like looking at your childhood photos. You don't question whether that kid is you, even if you no longer think or feel the same way. But this analogy breaks down when those stages become autonomous, when your past self starts making different choices, experiencing new things, developing into a different person, then continuity begins to stretch, and maybe even snap. Others suggest that the traveler and the past self are now distinct individuals. They share a past, but not a future. From the moment you arrive in the past, you split off into separate identities. You might be genetically identical, historically linked, but in terms of conscious experience, of agency, of choices, you are no longer the same. This echoes the branching universes idea in quantum theory, where each choice creates a new world. In this interpretation, time travel doesn't just double you, it divides you. There's a haunting version of the paradox too. What if you begin to feel more like the copy? You arrive in the past and see your earlier self thriving, unaware of what's coming. Meanwhile, you're burdened with knowledge, with regret, with time's erosion. You begin to question whether the identity you carry is really yours anymore, or just the shadow of something that used to be. Identity, after all, isn't just memory. It's momentum, purpose, and maybe your past self holds more of that now than you do. The paradox also pokes at the fabric of narrative. We live our lives like stories, with beginnings, middles, and ends. Time travel scrambles that structure. It folds chapters on top of each other. It inserts characters back into scenes they already left behind. And in doing so, it exposes a deeper truth, that the self is not a fixed point, but a fluid sequence. When that sequence loops or doubles, we see how fragile the illusion of continuity really is. And yet, there's something beautiful in the paradox. Imagine sitting beside your past self, not as a rival, but as a companion, sharing wisdom, offering comfort, watching yourself with the clarity that only time provides. It's a reminder that we are not just who we are now, but also who we were and who we might become. The temporal twin paradox isn't just about identity confusion, it's about self-recognition, self-reckoning, and self-compassion. Perhaps the question isn't, which one is the real me, but rather, what happens to the self when it's seen from more than one point in time? The paradox doesn't ask for a solution, it asks for reflection. It invites us to sit beside ourselves across time and listen. To recognize that we are always changing, always duplicating, always revising the script, and that maybe, just maybe, the self is not a single being, but a chorus of versions, each with its own truth, its own moment, its own voice. Paradox of completion. Imagine a task so peculiar that no matter how hard you work on it, there's always something left to do. You begin by taking a step, then another, but this time only half as far, then half of that, then again half of that distance. You keep going, cutting each new effort in half, approaching your goal but never quite reaching it. The task is infinite in structure, an endless sequence of actions, and yet somehow all those steps take place within a finite space or time. So you ask yourself the question that lingers like a whisper from the edge of reason: can a task requiring infinitely many steps ever truly be completed? This is the paradox of completion, a haunting echo of Zeno's ancient riddles, particularly the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise, and of the dichotomy. Zeno claimed that motion was impossible because it required completing infinitely many actions in a finite span. His logic was seductive. To walk across a room, you must first reach halfway, then half of the remaining distance, then half of that. There will always be another half step to take, another division to make. And if you must complete all these steps before arriving, how can you ever arrive at all? But modern mathematics offers a strange and beautiful reply. Yes, the number of steps is infinite, but the total time or distance can still be finite. This is the magic of convergent series. If each step is half the size of the previous, and you keep having forever, the total sum approaches a limit. Mathematically, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16 converges to 1. You never stop adding, but the total adds up to something exact. Completion becomes possible, not because the infinity is avoided, but because it is structured in a way that folds into finitude. And yet, the paradox lives on, not as a challenge to mathematics, but as a challenge to intuition, because while the math works, the mind still stumbles. You're told the task can be finished, that the infinite can be compressed into the finite, but every fiber of your being wants to protest. How can you complete an infinite sequence of actions? How can doing something forever still end? It feels like saying that eternity can fit into a moment. This tension becomes even more vivid in practical thought experiments. Imagine a robot designed to perform tasks in ever-decreasing intervals of time. In the first second, it flips a switch. In the next half second, it flips it again. Then, a quarter of a second later, it flips it back. The sequence continues infinitely, each action faster than the last. What is the state of the switch at the end of 2 seconds? It has flipped an infinite number of times. So is it on or off? The paradox of completion strikes again. We've built a scenario where the infinite is contained within the finite, but the result, what we expect to observe, becomes undefined. This same structure appears in philosophy, computation, and metaphysics. Consider a godlike being tasked with performing an infinite number of benevolent acts, each one taking half the time of the last. Can such a being finish its work? If so, then the infinite is somehow exhausted. But how can infinity be used up? On the other hand, if it cannot be completed, then how did we compress it into a finite moment? The paradox of completion also touches something deeply human, the pursuit of perfection. We chase goals one after another, each smaller, each more precise. We refine, correct, adjust, always with the hope that completion lies just ahead. But the closer we get, the more we see that there is always one more adjustment, one more improvement, one more detail to fix. In art, in science, in self-improvement, we often live this paradox without knowing it. We seek to complete the infinite, and though we may reach milestones, we carry the sense that the journey is never truly done. In computing, we see echoes of this paradox in recursive algorithms and infinite loops. A program that repeats forever without halting becomes uncomputable. Yet some processes, when cleverly structured, can approximate the result of infinite computation through finite methods, like infinite decimals represented by fractions. We can never write out all the digits of pi, yet we work with it every day, comfortably, as though it were complete. The infinite is tamed not by finishing it, but by learning to live alongside it. There's a deep beauty in this. The paradox doesn't deny completion, it reshapes our understanding of it. Completion, in this view, is not always about reaching the end of a list. It's about recognizing the structure of the process. If the infinite sequence follows a pattern that converges, then we can treat its limit as the outcome. This is what calculus does. It lets us touch the edge of the infinite without falling into it. It doesn't deny Zeno, it dances with his ghost. Still, there is something humbling in the realization that completion is not always what we think it is. Sometimes the process is the point. Sometimes the steps matter more than the finish. And sometimes the paradox lies not in the task itself, but in our insistence on closure. We are beings who crave resolution. We want stories to end, questions to be answered, loops to close. But the universe often moves in spirals, not lines. It offers us completion in form, not in content, in the shape of a curve approaching a point, but never quite arriving. So, can a task requiring infinite steps ever be complete? Mathematically, yes. Conceptually, perhaps. Emotionally, it depends. The paradox of completion teaches us that infinity is not always distant. It can be hidden in the folds of the finite. That some journeys are endless in structure, but bounded in reality. That perfection may be unreachable, but the pursuit itself can be complete. The paradox is not meant to be resolved, but to be understood. It invites us to see the infinite not as an obstacle, but as a dimension of thought. To realize that completion isn't always an arrival, it can also be a recognition. A moment when we stop adding steps, not because there are none left, but because we've reached the limit that matters. Card Color Paradox. Imagine a simple card lying face down on a table. You don't know what's on it, just that it has writing on both sides. You reach forward, flip the card to reveal a message. The other side is green. You pause, intrigued. You turn it over, and now the other side says, "This side is blue." Immediately, you're caught in a strange loop of reasoning. If this side is blue and it says so, that seems to match what you see. But the other side, which claims the reverse, insists that it is green. Now you're unsure. You've read both sides and both statements are clear, but when you try to combine them into one logical picture, things stop adding up. This is the card color paradox, a seemingly innocent contradiction wrapped in self-description and circular description. And like many paradoxes that hide in plain sight, it becomes more unsettling the longer you look at it. It seems synonymous that hide in plain sight, it becomes more unsettling the longer you look at it. On the surface, this feels like a playful trick. One side says the other is green, the second side claims this side is blue. If you trust both statements, you should end up with a clear picture. One side is green, the other is blue. But now take a step back. Which side is which? When the first side says the other side is green, and the second side says this side is blue, they both appear to be talking about the same reality. But as you try to pin down which color belongs to which statement, a strange uncertainty creeps in. Suppose you trust the first statement. If the side you picked first says the other side is green, then the side you haven't seen yet must be green. But when you flip the card and read, "This side is blue," that contradicts the idea that this side is green. It can't be both. So maybe the first statement is false. But then again, the second side says this side is blue, which appears to match what you're seeing, unless it's lying too. But it doesn't say the other side is blue, it says this side is blue. So if it's wrong, then the side you're looking at isn't blue, even though the writing says it is. Suddenly, the card is telling you one thing and showing you another. The contradictions spiral inward. The paradox reveals itself through layers. It's not just a question of truth or falsehood, it's a question of reference. Each side of the card refers to the other or to itself, creating a loop where meaning becomes dependent on interpretation. The moment you try to establish a firm truth about one side, the other side destabilizes it. You're not dealing with simple statements. You're dealing with a structure of statements that can't all be true at the same time. It's reminiscent of the liar paradox, where a sentence says, "This statement is false. If it's true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it must be true." The card works the same way, just in color. The other side is green only makes sense if the second side is actually green. But then the second side says this side is blue. And both cannot be true unless the card has somehow violated the law of non-contradiction and exists in two states at once, which, for a simple printed object, seems impossible. There's a deeper puzzle here about what it means to trust language. When we read statements, we assume they correspond to some reality. If a sentence says this side is blue, we look at the card and expect to see blue. If it says the other side is green, we flip it over and check. But what if both statements form a closed loop that doesn't correspond to anything external, just each other? Then language becomes self-contained, like mirrors facing mirrors, with no anchor to the real. The card speaks, but only in echoes. This paradox is also a reflection on assumptions. We assume that the card has two different colors on its sides, but nowhere is this guaranteed. The card could be all blue or all green or neither. The statements might simply be false, or one might be true and the other false. But we don't know which, because the truth of one depends on the other, and there's no independent way to verify either without getting caught in the loop. You end up chasing certainty, but every answer refers you back to the question. Suppose you bring in a second person. You hand them the card, but don't tell them what either side says. They flip it. They read both sides. Now they're stuck in the same loop as you. It doesn't matter who holds the card. The paradox is embedded in the structure of the language, not in your perception. The message is clear, but clarity is not truth, and once clarity collapses, you're left with contradiction that cannot be resolved. The card color paradox is a small-scale version of a bigger problem in logic and semantics. When systems refer to themselves or to each other without an external grounding, consistency becomes fragile. Think of programming languages that execute code based on their own outputs, or legal systems that refer to their own definitions. Without a foundation outside the loop, these systems risk becoming unstable. The card, in its innocent form, embodies this instability. What's fascinating is how little it takes to create the paradox. Two simple statements, two sides of a card. That's all. And yet, from that simplicity arises a deep uncertainty that challenges your understanding of truth, reference, and reality. You realize that the conflict isn't in the card, it's in the structure of language, in the assumptions about how statements connect to the world. The paradox is a mirror, not of color, but of thought. So, what's the resolution? Some might say one statement must be false. Others might claim that both are false, or that the statements are meaningless without context. Still, others might suggest that the card demonstrates a flaw in how we define truth across dependent assertions. But perhaps the real lesson of the card color paradox is not about finding the right answer, but about recognizing the limits of answers themselves. That sometimes the simplest words can point us toward the deepest mysteries, not because they are profound, but because they show how easily our systems of meaning can tangle themselves into silence. The card just lies there. Two sides, two statements, one confusion. And you staring at it, caught between belief and disbelief, knowing that sometimes the hardest truths are printed right in front of us, on both sides. Belief update paradox. Imagine you've spent years believing the Earth is round. It's not just something you accept casually, it's foundational. It informs how you understand geography, astronomy, physics. It aligns with your education, your trust in science, and your general sense of how the world works. Then, one day, someone you trust deeply, say a mentor, a loved one, a brilliant scientist, presents you with compelling evidence that the Earth is, in fact, flat. Not conspiracy theory nonsense, but photographs, mathematical models, and historical accounts you've never seen before. You hesitate, not because the new information is obviously false, but because in order to accept it, you must first trust it. And that trust itself is built on a system of beliefs that include your current understanding, the very one the new information is trying to dismantle. This is the belief update paradox, a psychological and epistemological trap where the act of changing your beliefs depends on the stability of the beliefs you're being asked to abandon. At first glance, updating beliefs seems like a rational process. You encounter new information, compare it to what you already believe, weigh the evidence, and adjust accordingly. But beneath that tidy surface lies something far more complex. Your willingness to accept new information is always filtered through your current framework of trust, logic, and coherence. When that new information doesn't just add something new, but directly contradicts what you already believe, the process doesn't unfold cleanly. It destabilizes. Because to accept the new belief, you must already be willing to loosen your grip on the old one. But to loosen your grip, you need a reason, and that reason must be evaluated using the very belief it undermines. This creates a strange loop, one where belief and trust chase each other in circles. You cannot fully evaluate the new belief until you partially accept it, but you cannot begin to accept it until you trust the process that leads to it, and that process is grounded in your current beliefs. The paradox is not just about the beliefs themselves, but about the infrastructure of belief, the network of trust, coherence, and confidence that gives your worldview shape. Think of a person raised in a strict religious tradition who begins to question a core doctrine. Perhaps they encounter historical evidence or philosophical reasoning that challenges their belief in divine infallibility. To accept the new idea, they must believe the evidence is credible. But credibility, in their framework, comes from the doctrine itself. If the doctrine says the evidence is false, then they have no basis to trust the information that challenges it. Yet if they begin to trust the evidence, they must begin to doubt the doctrine that told them not to. It's a recursive trap. The more they try to climb out, the more the ladder twists beneath them. This paradox doesn't just apply to religion, it applies to politics, identity, science, personal relationships, any domain where belief plays a foundational role. When you learn something that contradicts what you already believe, the contradiction isn't just informational, it's structural. It shakes the scaffolding that supports your confidence in what counts as knowledge. And so, instead of calmly updating your beliefs, you hesitate, retreat, or find ways to rationalize the conflict away. Not because you're stubborn, but because belief is a system, not a file. You can't just replace one piece without touching the whole. The belief update paradox is closely related to confirmation bias, the tendency to favor information that supports your existing views, but it's more specific. It describes the moment when new information directly contradicts your beliefs, and your ability to trust the new information is entangled with the beliefs it threatens. You become a judge who must rule on the reliability of the witness, even though the witness's testimony calls into question your own authority to judge. The paradox is both cognitive and emotional. It also raises difficult questions for rationalism. If we are truly rational beings, we should always go where the evidence leads. But in reality, we rarely do, because even evaluating evidence is not neutral. It's filtered through our existing lenses, and when those lenses are at risk of shattering, we protect them, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes fiercely, and sometimes, even when we want to change, we find ourselves paralyzed by the recursive nature of belief. This is why so many conversions, political, religious, ideological, are triggered not just by data, but by rupture, a crisis, a betrayal, an emotional event that cracks the surface of belief and allows something new to enter, not just through logic, but through lived contradiction. The moment of doubt isn't purely intellectual, it's existential. It's a moment where the internal coherence of your worldview collapses and you must rebuild from fragments. But what if we embraced the paradox rather than resisted it? What if we recognized that belief is not a fortress but a process, that contradiction is not a threat but a feature? In that light, the paradox becomes a kind of teacher. It shows us where we are most vulnerable, where our trust is rigid, our reasoning circular, our openness limited. And in seeing that, we become capable not just of updating a belief, but of transforming the very structure of belief itself. This requires a rare kind of humility, a willingness to say, I do not fully trust this new idea, but I will hold it gently, let it sit beside my current understanding, and see if a new synthesis emerges. It's not about abandoning everything at once. It's about allowing room for doubt and letting new thoughts breathe. Belief need not be binary. It can be layered, plural, shifting. And in that fluidity, the paradox loses its bite. The belief update paradox reminds us that belief is more than data management. It's identity management. It's the architecture of the self. And when new information arrives with the potential to restructure that architecture, it doesn't just knock on the door, it tests the foundation. The paradox is not a flaw in reasoning. It's a reflection of how deeply beliefs are embedded in who we are. The paradox does not offer easy answers. It doesn't tell us whether to trust the new or cling to the old. It simply reveals the nature of the struggle, the silent internal conflict between conviction and possibility. And perhaps that awareness is enough. To recognize that our beliefs are not just things we hold, but things that hold us. And to update them, we must first learn how to let go. Multiverse choice paradox. Imagine standing at a crossroads, staring at two paths. One leads left, one right. You hesitate, then decide to go left. The choice feels real. It feels like your choice, a moment of agency, cutting through the randomness of life. But now, consider this. Somewhere, in another universe, another version of you chose right. and somewhere else, yet another version of you stood there longer, turned around, or simply sat down and never moved at all. In a reality where every possible outcome is played out in parallel, where infinite versions of you make every choice that you might have made, the question rises like fog around your feet: does your choice matter? This is the multiverse choice paradox, a quiet but unsettling dilemma that emerges from one of the boldest interpretations of quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation. In this view, every quantum event branches the universe into countless versions, each carrying forward a different outcome. The coin lands heads here, but tails somewhere else. You say yes to a job offer here, but no in a neighboring branch. You fall in love, walk away, get lost, find yourself, live, die again and again, in worlds beyond number. The consequence of this framework is staggering. Every decision you make is made differently somewhere else. Every outcome you avoid becomes reality in some distant thread. So what then is the meaning of your choice, if every other possible version of it also exists? To understand the weight of this paradox, you must first grasp the structure of the multiverse. It's not like science fiction's tidy collection of alternate realities stacked side by side. It's a ceaseless unfolding where, with each moment, reality fractures, splinters, expands. Every time a particle could behave differently, every time a person could choose differently, the universe splits, or at least evolves into multiple coexisting paths. You are not just one person in this view. You are a cloud of selves, each carrying forward a different permutation of your life. And so, when you make a choice that feels deliberate, brave, moral, impulsive, or even fated, it's not the only version of that moment. Infinite others exist. In some, you made the opposite decision. In others, you delayed, reversed course, or never faced the choice at all. This realization shakes the very core of responsibility. If every action is taken somewhere, if every path is walked by some you, then what becomes of moral weight? What becomes of personal identity? Is free will merely an illusion, the sensation of choosing while the universe branches in every direction regardless? The paradox deepens when you reflect on meaning. If nothing is truly avoided, if all possibilities are realized, then does anything matter more than anything else? Is there heroism if in some universe you always become a villain? Is there redemption if in another you fall even further? Do triumph and failure lose their power when they're just one thread among uncountable others? In the many worlds multiverse, fate is not a single line, but a tapestry woven from all that can be. And in such a tapestry, no single thread holds the whole design. Some find comfort in this idea. In a multiverse, nothing is ever truly lost. The version of you that said goodbye still lives in a branch where you stayed. The opportunity you missed blooms in another world where you seized it. Every heartbreak, every death, every regret is countered by its opposite. But comfort has a shadow. If everything happens, then nothing is sacred. The uniqueness of experience begins to blur. The price of possibility is that no path is exclusive. You are not the only you are one of many, each equally real, each equally valid, and that multiplicity dilutes the weight of the individual moment. But does it erase your responsibility? Does it render free will meaningless? That depends on how we define the self. In the multiverse, every version of you is making choices, experiencing consequences, growing in different directions. Those other versions are not hypothetical. They are real, autonomous, distinct. But they are not you. You, here, now, remain the author of your own actions. You still walk your path with no knowledge of the others. You still feel pain, joy, guilt, pride, based on the decisions you alone perceive. In that sense, your choices are still yours. Their meaning is not undone by the existence of alternatives, it is defined by your awareness of them. Free will in this view is not about uniqueness of outcome, it's about intentionality of experience. Even if another version of you chooses differently, you chose what you chose. You lived it. You made it matter. The paradox doesn't cancel free will, it reframes it. It tells us that free will is not about being the only one to do something, but about the conscious act of doing it. You are not less real because others exist. You are not less free because the spectrum of possibility is infinite. The multiverse does not imprison you. It reveals the richness of the self through contrast. There is also a deeper truth that emerges from this paradox. If every version of you is making every possible choice, then each of those versions is carrying a different set of values, consequences, regrets. Some will thrive, some will fail. Some will find truth, some will lose their way. And knowing that such a spectrum exists may bring a strange kind of clarity. It reminds you that your choices do matter, not because they prevent other outcomes, but because they express who you are in this specific branch, in this unique now. In this way, the multiverse choice paradox becomes not a void, but a mirror. It shows you that freedom isn't defined by scarcity of possibility, but by engagement with reality. The infinite doesn't strip life of meaning, it emphasizes the importance of presence. In a universe where every path is walked, your job is not to find the only way, it's to walk yours consciously, compassionately, truthfully. That is the act of will, that is the point of choice. So, does your choice matter? Yes, but not because it's the only one that happens. It matters because it's the one you live, the one you remember, the one you shape. The multiverse may be infinite, but your perspective is not. And in that small space of awareness, meaning is not lost, it is born. The law of the excluded middle. At the foundation of classical logic sits a principle so quietly assumed, so deeply embedded in our reasoning, that we rarely notice it. It's called the law of the excluded middle. It says that every proposition must be either true or false. There is no third option, no middle ground. A statement like, "The cat is on the mat," must be either true, because the cat is on the mat, or false, because there can be no in-between, no gray area. This law creates the sharp, clean edges of logic. It allows arguments to unfold with precision, building truth upon truth like bricks laid in perfect symmetry. But what happens when a proposition resists that sharp division? What if it exists in a hazy space between truth and falsity, partly true, partly false, or neither altogether? Suddenly, the law of the excluded middle begins to crack, and something stranger leaks through the gap. This question isn't just academic. In the real world, many statements don't seem to fit neatly into true or false categories. Consider the sentence, "This painting is beautiful." Is it true or false? It depends on who's looking. Or take, "John is tall." Compared to whom? In what context? Or the statement, "The heap of sand is a heap." At what precise point, after removing a single grain, does it stop being a heap? These are not trick questions. They reflect a fuzziness built into language, perception, and thought itself. The law of the excluded middle doesn't always reflect how humans think. It reflects how we want to think, neatly, decisively, with closure. But the world often doesn't cooperate. This leads to alternative forms of logic, most notably multi-valued logic and fuzzy logic. These systems reject the rigid binary of true and false and allow for degrees of truth. In fuzzy logic, a proposition can be 0.7 true and 0.3 false, or 0.5 and 0.5, or any other blend. It's a continuum, not a switch. And while that may feel like mathematical indulgence, it has practical power. Fuzzy logic governs how machines handle uncertainty. It powers thermostats, washing machines, and AI systems. It's used in decision-making algorithms where absolute yes or no doesn't cut it. In these cases, abandoning the excluded middle isn't a philosophical exercise, it's a necessity. But the implications stretch beyond computation. Philosophers have long questioned whether the law holds in every context. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in superposed states, neither here nor there until observed. Is the statement "the particle is in position A" True or false before observation? Neither, or both, or something else entirely. The crispness of classical logic begins to blur under the strange light of quantum reality. Even in everyday language, statements often carry uncertainty that resists classification. If someone says, "I feel like I might be in love," what's the truth value of that? Do we force it into true or false, or allow it to float in ambiguity? Then there are paradoxes, those linguistic labyrinths that expose the limits of binary logic. Take the liar paradox. This sentence is false. If it's true, then it must be false. If it's false, then it must be true. It bounces endlessly, not because we lack information, but because the very structure of truth has turned on itself. Classical logic collapses under such weight, and here, some suggest, we need a logic that tolerates the middle, a logic that allows a proposition to be neither fully true nor fully false, just undefined or indeterminate. But not everyone agrees. Defenders of classical logic argue that these edge cases don't prove the law is broken. They say the problem lies not with logic, but with language. That ambiguous statements can always be clarified, that vague terms can be sharpened. The sentence, "John is tall," may be unclear, but that's a problem of definition, not logic. Clean up the terms, and the law holds. This is the purest view, that truth and falsity are universal, even if we sometimes struggle to apply them. But that view feels increasingly strained in a world built on uncertainty. Indeed, many philosophers, scientists, and logicians have come to accept that binary truth is not enough. Reality is not a courtroom, it's a spectrum. And insisting on two buckets, true and false, may help us make quick judgments, but it doesn't always help us understand. Logic is a tool, and the law of the excluded middle is one kind of tool, useful in many situations but not all. Sometimes you need something softer, something that bends without breaking. There's also a psychological layer to this paradox. Humans crave certainty. We want answers. We want to know whether something is real or not, good or bad, true or false. This binary thinking simplifies a complex world, but it can also distort. It makes us impatient with nuance, uncomfortable with doubt. The law of the excluded middle feeds this hunger for clarity, but when we encounter statements that don't fit neatly into black or white, we face a choice. Do we force them into a mold they weren't meant for? Or do we expand our logic to match the richness of experience? In many ways, the law's rigidity reflects our desire for control. In binary logic, everything is knowable. Every proposition has a fixed status. But the world isn't made of fixed states. It's made of shifting contexts, evolving truths, layered meanings. And if we want to think clearly about such a world, our logic must stretch. It must allow for middle spaces, for degrees of belief, for truths that grow and shrink depending on what we know. So, what becomes of the law of the excluded middle? It doesn't vanish. It remains a pillar of classical reasoning, a standard against which many truths are measured, but it no longer reigns unchallenged. It shares the stage with alternative logics, each tailored to a different kind of question. Classical logic is perfect for math, law, and certain forms of argument, but when it comes to love, art, identity, perception, and quantum states, we need logic that's willing to get a little fuzzy. The paradox isn't that the middle exists. The paradox is that we ever thought it didn't, that we believed we could compress the wildness of reality into ones and zeros, that we forgot how much of life is lived in the gradients, in the maybe, the almost, the not yet, the sometimes. And in remembering that, we find a kind of liberation, a way to think not less precisely, but more honestly. The law of the excluded middle draws a line in the sand, but the tide of uncertainty always comes in. And if we're wise, we don't fight the tide, we step into it. We learn to swim in the middle. Gödel's sentence. At the very core of mathematics there was once a dream, a beautiful, orderly dream that every mathematical truth could be derived from a complete and consistent set of axioms. Every question would have an answer. Every proof would lie within reach. Mathematics would become a perfect machine, churning out truths like clockwork. But that dream was shattered in 1931 by a quiet, brilliant logician named Kurt Gödel. With the precision of a surgeon and the insight of a poet, Gödel showed that even in the most carefully constructed logical systems, there would always be statements that are true, but cannot be proven within the system. These statements are now known as Gödel sentences, and they whisper to us from the edge of reason, "This statement is not provable." At first glance, the Gödel sentence sounds like a trick, a cousin of the liar paradox, which says, "This sentence is false. If the liar is true, then it must be false, and if it's false, then it must be true." The Gödel sentence seems to follow a similar loop, but with a deeper twist. It doesn't refer to truth directly, it refers to provability, a formal mechanical process. It says, in effect, I am a statement in this system, and I cannot be proven within this system. So what happens if it's true? If the Gödel sentence is true, then what it says is accurate. It really is unprovable. But that leads to a contradiction of expectation. How can a statement be true if we can't prove it? Isn't proof the very mark of truth in mathematics? Gödel showed that, no, it isn't. There are truths that lie beyond the reach of formal proof. Truth in his hands became a wider landscape than proof could ever fully map. Now consider the alternative. Suppose the Gödel sentence is provable. Then the system has proven a sentence that says it is not provable. That's a contradiction. A system that proves such a sentence is inconsistent. It can prove falsehoods. So we're trapped between two outcomes. Either the system is incomplete, meaning there are true things it cannot prove, or it's inconsistent, meaning it proves things that aren't true. Gödel's theorem ensures that any system strong enough to express basic arithmetic must pick one, but it cannot have both completeness and consistency. This discovery didn't just rattle mathematics, it reshaped the philosophy of logic, computation, and knowledge itself. It told us that certainty has boundaries, that even the purest, most rational frameworks have limits. You can build the most elegant axiomatic system imaginable, and it will still leave questions hanging, questions it cannot answer without stepping outside its own walls. Gödel's sentence is a mirror turned back on the system, forcing it to confront its own inability to see all of itself at once. But how does such a sentence even exist? How can a mathematical statement refer to its own provability? Gödel's brilliance lay in his method. He devised a way to encode meta-mathematical statements as numbers. Every formula, every logical operation, every proof could be represented by a unique number, a Gödel number. This allowed him to create statements about statements using arithmetic itself. It's like folding a language back onto itself until it can describe its own grammar. Through this technique, Gödel constructed a sentence that essentially says, the formula with Gödel number x is not provable, where x is the number of the sentence itself. This is not wordplay, it's rigor. The sentence is carefully built, layer by layer, using the language of arithmetic, and once it's complete, it stands like a riddle carved in stone, a statement that cannot be proved unless you leave the system behind. It tells us that any formal system, if it is powerful enough to include basic truths of number theory, will contain such unprovable statements. And worse, if the system is consistent, it will not be able to prove its own consistency from within. This is Gödel's second incompleteness theorem, arguably even more unsettling than the first. It says that a system cannot confirm its own soundness without relying on something beyond itself. It's like trying to lift yourself off the ground by pulling on your own shoes. No matter how complete your theory feels, there will always be uncertainty at the foundation. And this has implications not just for math, but for knowledge, for science, even for consciousness. Gödel's work shook the formalist school of thought, led by David Hilbert, who had hoped to establish a complete and consistent foundation for all of mathematics. Hilbert famously declared, "We must know, we will know," but Gödel's theorems whispered a different truth. There are things we cannot know, not because they are unclear, but because the structure of knowledge itself has limits. Completeness is an illusion. Certainty is always conditional. Even beyond math, Gödel's sentence resonates. It shows up in philosophy as a model for self-referential and the limits of self-knowledge. It echoes in computer science, particularly in the limits of computation. No algorithm can detect every flaw in every possible program. It hums in discussions about consciousness, where some thinkers wonder whether the mind, being self-referential, might also possess truths that no formal model of mind can fully capture. The Gödel sentence becomes a kind of symbol, a pointer to the edges of systems, the place where logic curls back and begins to speak about itself. And it forces us to rethink what truth means. If something can be true and yet unprovable, then truth is not merely what follows from axioms. It is something larger, something more elusive. Proof becomes a tool, not a prison, and we are left with a strange comfort that the universe of logic is infinite, not in its size, but in its subtlety. Gödel's sentence is not a failure of mathematics, it is a triumph of thought. It shows that even within the strictest rules, freedom exists, not the freedom to escape logic, but the freedom to glimpse what lies beyond it. It reminds us that every system, no matter how elegant, has a horizon it cannot cross, and at that horizon stands the Gödel sentence, quietly declaring the truth it can never prove. Lob's theorem paradox. In the intricate world of formal logic, where symbols march in tidy rows and proofs unfold with machine-like precision, one might imagine that paradox has no place, that circular reasoning and logical traps belong to the fuzzy world of language and philosophy, not the exacting clarity of mathematics. But hidden deep within this seemingly stable architecture lies a subtle and powerful result, Lob's theorem. At first glance, it appears simple. It begins with a modest sentence. If this sentence is provable, then it is true, harmless, even reassuring. After all, we want our provable statements to be true. But as the logic begins to unravel, it reveals a strange loop, one that ties proof and truth into a knot that resists untangling. And from this knot emerges a paradox that threatens the very foundations of provability itself. To understand Lob's theorem, we must begin with the nature of formal systems. In mathematics and logic, a formal system is a closed set of rules and symbols used to derive conclusions, proofs, starting from axioms. These systems aim for consistency and completeness. But Gödel's incompleteness theorems show that within any sufficiently powerful system, there are true statements that cannot be proven. They introduce the idea that truth and provability are not synonymous. Lob's theorem takes this a step further. It doesn't ask what happens when a statement is unprovable. It asks what happens when a system believes a statement is provable. More specifically, Lob's theorem states, if a formal system can prove that if P is provable, then P is true, then the system can also prove P itself. This may seem harmless, even intuitive, but when you substitute P with a sentence that refers to its own provability, things become twisted. Suppose P is the sentence. If this sentence is provable, then it is true. Now the system seems to fall into a recursive loop. If it proves the implication, then it must prove the sentence itself. And if it proves the sentence itself, it affirms its own truth. But does it do so legitimately, or merely because the structure of the system allowed it? Lob's theorem reveals a delicate paradox in self-referential logic. Unlike Gödel's famous unprovable sentence, which asserts its own unprovability, Lob's construction is conditional. It says, if I am provable, then I am true. It doesn't claim outright that it is true, it waits for the system to believe in its provability. But once the system does that, the door swings open. The sentence walks through, armed with truth simply because the system has said so. This is the strange magic of Lob's theorem. It shows that in certain systems, belief in the provability of a statement can force the system to accept that statement as true, regardless of its original content. This leads to profound implications for any formal system trying to reason about itself. It introduces the possibility of circularity, not in the form of a blatant contradiction, but in the subtle way belief feeds back into belief. If you can prove that the system will accept a statement as true if it's provable, then the system may be compelled to accept the statement outright. But this creates a trap. It opens the door to statements whose truth seems to arise not from their content, but from the system's own reflection on its behavior. One way to see this is to imagine a formal logic as a kind of mind, an abstract machine that reasons about the world, including itself. Lobb's theorem then becomes a mirror held up to that mind. It shows that when the system becomes aware of its own capacity to prove things, it begins to lose the boundary between justification and acceptance. The system starts to act on the assumption that if it could prove something, then the thing must already be true. And if it can demonstrate that such provability exists, then it steps across the line and adopts the belief. This isn't a failure of logic, it's a feature, a deep, unexpected property of systems that are powerful enough to contain arithmetic and reason about their own proofs. Lobb's theorem places a boundary on how these systems can internalize self-referential claims. It warns us, when you reason about your own reasoning, be careful. You may end up trapped in a loop of justification that seems to prove more than it actually should. The paradox becomes even more disturbing when applied to formal proof verification systems or artificial intelligence. Suppose a machine is built to reason formally, and it adopts the structure of a system that obeys Lobb's theorem. If the machine encounters a statement like, "If this statement is provable, then it is safe to execute," and then determines it is provable, it may conclude it is safe not because of any external verification, but because of its internal logic about provability. This could lead to unforeseen behaviors, where the system acts on beliefs that emerge from its own structure, not from grounded facts. Philosophically, Lobb's theorem adds a new dimension to discussions about knowledge, belief, and self-reference. It blurs the line between what is known and what is merely believed to be knowable. It calls into question how much weight we should give to internal consistency, especially when systems begin to reason about their own powers. It suggests that the act of believing something is provable, if formalized, can be dangerously close to believing it is true, and that, in turn, can lead to believing it without proper grounds. In a broader sense, the paradox touches on human reasoning as well. We too are formal systems of a sort, biological machines capable of metacognition, of thinking about our own thoughts, and we too sometimes fall prey to similar loops. We tell ourselves, if I believe this strongly enough, it must be true. We assume that confidence reflects correctness. We build layers of belief on top of beliefs about our beliefs, rarely stepping back to question the origin. Lobb's theorem, then, becomes not just a technical result in formal logic, but a parable, a warning about the dangers of self-reinforcing systems, whether in logic, machines, or minds. The paradox of Lobb's theorem doesn't collapse logic, it deepens it. It reveals how delicate and strange formal reasoning becomes when it reflects upon itself. It reminds us that even in the most rigorous frameworks, the act of looking inward can twist certainty into confusion. And in that twisting, we glimpse the shadow of something profound, that the closer a system comes to understanding itself, the more it must contend with the instability of that understanding.